Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This week I have my good friend and colleague, Simona Efanov. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, and we talk about a whole variety of things this week. Simona has a background and expertise in studying stress and how it works within our body, and so we talk about that for a good part of the episode this week. She gives us various definitions of stress, kind of the aspects of positive stressors, and then obviously the negative stressors. We talk about long-term versus short-term stressors. We give a review of kind of neuroanatomy, and then we launch into a discussion of the HPA axis, the cycle of stress. We then talk about defining emotions overall, and then an explanation of chronic stress and the differences between chronic stress and then trauma. We don't get into trauma too much. We kind of notice it and talk about it a bit, but we that's probably an episode on its own. And then we get into the broad definition of clinical psychology and its functions and efficacy, including the development and creation of statistical methods by psychologists in the 20th century, and then psychological assessment, which is the primary function of, or one of the primary functions of clinical psychologists. We do a small amount of talking about the differences between the PhDs and PsyDs in clinical psychology. And then we talk about the current challenges to the field of psychology, including the politicization of the APA and a few other organizations. We talk about the role of explaining psychological science and the scientific data and literature and research to the public in easy and understandable ways without watering down the content. And then the last bit of the conversation, we give some critiques of self-help and pop psychology. We say some good things about it, but we do give some critiques about this very popularized notion within the society about self-help. And so we talk a little bit about the overemphasis that some people in this field will rely on titles within self-help books, and so then we give an example of somebody that's doing this work. So the last part of the conversation is maybe the last third or quarter of the conversation is on Brene Brown, and I'd like to make a few clarifying statements, mostly on my end here. So we talk about Brene Brown, and we try to give a very charitable reading of her, her whole enterprise, how she's doing things. But we spend a good part of the conversation critiquing her, and quite strongly, I'll say, especially on my end. And I stand by everything I said. As I listen back to the episode, I stand by my criticisms, and they are strong. They are strong criticisms. And I thought about this, and I don't say those things lightly. We have to care about how information is presented, and whether that's saying, whatever claims about ourselves, our titles, our authority on certain subjects, or just the content of the research itself. And this is important because we have a big problem in society at the moment of misinformation and people not being able to trust quote unquote experts. And we need people in our field, psychology or sociology or social psych or, other fields to say, hey, this isn't right, or, we need to correct for this. And I don't hear a lot of that. People kind of critiquing her from within the field of mental health and clinical world on some of her stuff. And so I'm not saying that I need to be leading the charge on that, but it started as an example, and that was the kind of point. I don't have any animus towards her, regardless of my strong criticisms and statements, but I do want uh, healthy, ethical information from within the psychological research to be disseminated appropriately to the public. And I am passionate about that, and I'll critique it when I see that it's not done that way. So I stand by my statements, as strong as they are, and I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts about them as well. So, anyways, all that to say, this was a lovely, lovely conversation with my friend and colleague, and I definitely want to talk to her again in the future about other topics we just didn't have time to get to. So I bring you Simona Efanov. I am here with Simona Efanov. Simona, what's going on? How are you?
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for
It's
having
good.
me.
Yeah, of course. Yes, I'm glad to have you. I'm glad we get you on here. So, for those of you that don't know, Simona is a very good friend of mine. We're colleagues, or we were colleagues together. We were in school together. So, I personally know her. She is brilliant in her own right. So, I wanted to get her on here. She has many things to share, many good ideas that we can discuss. And so, why don't you tell people, the listeners, what are a little bit about you, mostly your background, um, probably mostly academically, career wise, although you can share personally if you want to as well, and what you're currently doing, and kind of primary interest and anything in the future.
Mhm. Okay. Well, thank you. I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I practice in Virginia, and at this time, I provide individual therapy, couples therapy, and also psychological assessments whenever things can reopen and we can actually
Hmm.
conduct assessments. I'm a clinical supervisor for doctoral externs, interns, and postdocs. I've taught a variety of courses at university here in the Washington, D.C. area, most of which were both assessment classes, but also the neurobasis of behavior, psychopharmacology.
Hmm.
Ethics was my last one this semester that I've taught, I believe, twice at this time,
Hmm.
um, for folks being in their graduate and their PsyD program. Usually it consists of students anywhere from, first to fourth years.
Hmm.
So very wide, and that's what I do now. So I do many different things.
What's your kind of background? I guess kind of some of your, where you've, I guess, gone to school, or some of your interests, and then I guess where it leads up to you currently.
Yeah. Well, I started not knowing I would end up, being a clinical psychologist. I was interested in neuroscience and psychology is a field, almost
Hmm.
also from a philosophical perspective. I wanted to understand humans and who they are at the core. So I've started studying humans from an anatomical perspective. I got my undergrad at McGill University in anatomy and cell biology. That's where I first started, and I loved every class and every aspect of it.
Hmm. Yeah.
I still think of those days, with grand fondness about how much fun it was. But then when I graduated, I felt there were a couple of pieces that were missing. So I went ahead and I signed up for a second undergrad where I studied psychology because I wanted to go more towards the study of the brain and connection with the human mind and how that impacts behaviors,
Hmm.
emotion. I did that, after which I started working with a number of research labs at McGill, at the Montreal Neurological Institute first, which is affiliated with McGill University. And then I transitioned to the stress lab, which was a part of a major hospital in the Montreal area,
Hmm.
where I assisted a number of studies on the impacts of human stress on subclinical levels of depression, personality variables. We looked at healthy individuals, meaning individuals without a history of mental health problems at first, and then different studies looked at, of course, different subgroups as
Hmm.
part of that that lab. So I also enjoyed my research time very much with that
Hmm.
lab. I learned a whole lot. I think that's where my thirst for research and for really understanding ways in which perceived stress impacts us in so many different ways initially started. And then I transitioned to a different lab that was looking more specifically at, again, how the stress and brain correlates impact individuals with very severe cases of anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. So I took
Hmm.
part of the research projects that we were working on transitioned to the eating disorder clinic of the same hospital. And I spent about a year working with them. And that's when I knew that, oh, I really love the clinical piece, the
Hmm.
integration of everything
Yeah.
I'm doing in research with the actual humanistic side of being with the person in the room and really trying to understand them as a holistic, from a holistic perspective.
Hmm.
So, at that point, I had finished my master's degree and I was a few years, within graduation. I said, oh, I'm going back to school.
Hmm.
I'm going for the doctoral part. So,
Hmm.
a few people in my workplace at that time were like, "Are you sure you don't want to do experimental psychology already?
Yeah.
And let's go
That
there." And,
that would
you
seem
know,
like the natural next step,
yeah.
obviously. That would
And
seem
at
the
the
natural one, yeah.
interview, it's kind of funny because when I interviewed in grad school, it's one of the first questions they ask: why not medicine and why not experimental?
Hmm.
And I had, a lot of answers about, as of why for me that was the route I specifically chose the PsyD route.
Yeah.
Um, because, and maybe we can talk about a little bit of at least some philosophical differences between the
Hmm.
PhD
Hmm.
and the PsyD routes, but I
Yeah.
felt like it was a really good fit for me for what I needed at that level and
Hmm.
training. So I left my research world behind, and I came to the clinical field. And I'm, just once you enter grad school, trying to be a clinical psychologist, you get on a train and you get off the train and you get licensed. So,
That's right.
so
Yeah.
here I
That's
am.
right. That's right.
Did not go back in research since then, but I'm still very passionate to know what's happening out there. I'm still
Hmm.
in touch with many people from those labs.
No, that's
In a
great.
nutshell.
That's a very nice complement of things in terms of, I think you said cell biology was the basis, which is, I think, super important for psychologists. It's not the be all end all, but I think it's really important. And it sounds like a large part of your career is rooted in research. I'm assuming empirical research. Yes.
Absolutely.
Um, so you know, and then transitioning to the more clinical components with people, and looking at different syndromes and how it manifests in individuals. And so, um, yeah, I mean, I can imagine, clients probably don't realize it, but there's a really nice holistic and rooted uh, perspective and information they're getting from the therapist across from them, someone that knows both ends of things. So I think that's it's very nice. Yeah, it's very well rounded.
Thank you. I try to remember the my previous self. It comes back every now and then as
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
topics come up. Yep, absolutely. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's still here. Yeah.
So okay, so there's a few things, a
Mhm.
few items that we want to tackle today. So I mean, you've already alluded to it. I would be remiss if I didn't get you on here and we talk about stress and how that works. And so more of, a physiological and neurological understanding of stress as opposed to maybe something a little bit more qualitative. So, yeah, why don't you tell us about that? I would say, probably as you get into it, you know, I may jump in and do some explanatory stuff. We can do that together, so that way
Mhm.
listeners can kind of
Mhm.
track along with it. But yeah, so why don't we start there with stress and how it works in the brain?
Okay. Well, that's a big topic. I hope we have enough time. I'm just kidding. I'll do my
Yeah, yeah, we'll take all the
confess.
time we need.
As we were, of course, planning for this, I was thinking, oh boy, how am I going to, summarize such a large field of research and of
Hmm.
clinical practice? I mean, we're talking about decades of really, really strong research
Yeah.
and publication. So, I'm by no means claiming I'm the expert in stress and human stress and behavior, but I think that one of the, of our responsibilities as clinical psychologists is to understand how to present some of these things. And I still enjoy this topic very much because it keeps me on my toes on, bringing the science to the public and bringing the science to the field while not making it be too intimidating. So, stress is a big word. Most people I always do this activity. Most people would think about a few examples or reactions that they may have to stress. Like if we were to, just take 10 seconds and think about what stress feels like, we would get different answers from different individuals. Some may experience it in their gut or in their shoulders, in their minds. That's kind of like the physical manifestations of stress. We all know what that may do and what to us and what that may feel like. But there are many definitions, and one of the ways that we looked at it when we conducted our research is the idea of psychosocial stress, meaning the stressors that are in society and that involve an evaluation process. So there's a really nice definition or acronym that is associated with it, and that's NUTS, meaning a situation that is new, novel, unpredictable. T, threatening to the self or to the ego, to an aspect of one's functioning, and then S is for sense of control that is perceived to be lost or at least challenged. So when we don't need to have all of these components, but any combination of such is considered part of this bigger bucket of psychosocial stress. The biological perspective, stress is a perception of a threat that needs to be perceived through one of the five senses. I mean, if we or through an internal reaction, of course, it has to enter the system first. The traditional example, if anyone sees a big, bear or the tiger chasing us, yes, there's no tiger in society really, but a loud noise or anything that may be sounding our alarm system is considered a stressor, a threat to the system. And from the moment that the brain and our system interprets the threat, there's a cascade of events that happen.
So let me jump in here then. So essentially, defining stress is very difficult because there's basically multi-dimensions or multi-layers of how stress can be defined or how it can be, I guess, a framing of sorts. And so you're using kind of two lenses at the same time, which is there's stress in the environment and stress in the outside world, but then which is, or I guess, potential stressors, I guess. And then for the individual, there's the internal way of which there are certain attributions or certain ways of evaluating what is or what is not stressful within the brain and within the body. And almost, I don't know if it's an absolute, but that there is one perceived stress, it is a threat. We don't see stress as a positive thing or some adaptive attribution. It's typically no.
Actually, we'll correct that last part. Yes.
Okay.
Up to that last part. Yeah. So there are physical stressors, it's all physical injuries, or again, things that happen to the body can be considered stressful. Like if we have a wound and we're bleeding, there's a lot of bleeding, that also activates the stress axis because, that's a physical threat. If we have a psychosocial, like I mentioned, those nuts kind of acronym that reflects to that, but it can come from a variety of systems. And funnily enough, there is a concept of positive stressors because they can trigger some of the same responses due to their valence, due to their impact that they may have. For example, having a child, not the process of birth. I'm talking about the whole construct of becoming a parent, weddings and getting married. Those are usually positive life events, but they can lead to a whole lot of stressors. Receiving a promotion or being put on the spot and, with the clap, that can lead an immediate response to stress that can be alleviated, of course, within minutes or, hours for some. So positive events can lead to that if they change the homeostasis, they change the
Mm-hmm.
balance, internal balance that people are used to. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's
Mhm.
super instructive. Okay. So you were, before I jumped in, you were talking about the kind of the internal aspects of how the body or ourself is reading stress. And so outside of that, so then maybe you were going to get more, I guess, specific of how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the moment that that is perceived, the system somehow, or I mean, there are many ways in how, but evaluates whether there are enough resources to respond to that perceived threat or that perceived stressor that comes to the body. And resources can mean anything from, biological resources, energy, um, uh, glucose in the system, to psychological resources and emotional resources. And whenever the demands of a particular situation, of the event, exceeds the resources, that's when we call it stress as well. Right?
Okay. So
Arguably, if we have resources and they balance out, may or may not be considered or perceived as a stressor.
so there's a basically when the bucket's full
Mhm.
for whichever person, then it's like, yeah, we have no more ammunition. We can't deal with this. Bucket's full, and obviously, I think it's kind of intuitive that some are going to have more resources than others, right?
Mhm.
Some, you might have more, I might have less, or
Mhm.
may have different ones.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or at
yeah,
different times. I mean, I may
different
have a
times. Yeah.
lot of resources now, but if, life happens and we become depleted of our resources, and say a month from now or a month ago from now, it may have been a complete different story. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in terms of, I guess, of the body, I don't know if you want to get
Mhm.
this, if I'm jumping ahead, but there's different things happening in the body.
Mhm.
Do you want to go straight to the brain, or do you want to keep telling me the overview of this?
No, we can go straight to what happens in an acute stress response. So let's
Okay.
have to differentiate between there's a short-term stressor and a long-term stressor, because there's a crossroad that happens based on the duration of those stressors. So,
Hmm.
when one of there are a couple of mechanisms that are going to eventually get activated. One is our usual traditional fight or flight, which we call the sympathetic nervous
Hmm.
system. It's going to give us an indication that the stressor is serious enough, so we can need to maybe to either fight, flight, or actually freeze is another
Hmm.
response that can.
It's a three-pronged approach, right? It's the freeze piece is the one, I guess, that I guess some people talk about it more, but it is a component of it.
It's relatively newer. It's more and more recognized as being the third potential adaptive response to threat.
Hmm.
We've observed this from the animal kingdom. It has survival, benefits. So, we're talking about things like adrenaline and noradrenaline being secreted to increase our heart rate, so we're able to, fight or flight, like get out of a situation. I mean, if there's a fire in the building, we want to get out of there as quickly as possible. It's instantaneous. We don't need to think about it. All mammals, my knowledge, or most mammals, have that fight or
Hmm.
flight response, and
Hmm.
it's very short, and it's very immediate, and it's supposed to be short lasting, which means that when the threat is gone, those hormones, those chemicals, eventually decrease, and we have returned to homeostasis, to the balance of the system. In parallel, the signal gets to another part of the brain, which is called the hypothalamus. It's a center right in the middle of the brain that mediates a whole lot of body reactions and hormonal, mediation, as well as sleep and hunger and a variety of other functions. And that's where we get the activation of what's called the HPA axis, the
Hmm.
hypothalamic, pituitary-adrenal axis, which is
Hmm.
a loop that connects, again, this hypothalamic structure with the pituitary gland, and then with the adrenal cortex of kidneys, that when upon activation, when secretion of the precursor hormones, getting us to the end goal is to have the adrenal cortex secrete cortisol, which is the main hormone in response to stress. It can be measured in the blood, and for example, in the lab I was working in, we were measuring it in saliva samples.
Hmm.
As some of the samples, kind of like a chemical
Hmm.
thing done, and we can see the indication of stress about 20 minutes after the onset of the stressor. And that's
Hmm.
very important, because while the sympathetic nervous system gives us an immediate response to, like I said, help get us out of there if we need to, it
Hmm.
takes a certain number of minutes, anywhere between 15 and 30 minutes, for the HPA system to lead to a response. And there's a reason for that, is that we want to have longer effects of the cortisol in the system. Cortisol has other functions than adrenaline and noradrenaline. We want to keep it standing. So we may not notice the effects of stress as we know it right away,
Mhm.
because there's a delay in its secretion.
So yeah, but before we keep going, let's do a 2 minute review here
Mhm.
of basic anatomy. Human body. You can broaden this out to other mammals and other animals, but let's stick with humans here. The human body has 11, 12 systems, right? Digestive, circulatory, or cardiovascular, respiratory, right?
Mhm.
And one of the systems is the central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and the spinal cord.
Mhm. Yep.
And outside of the central nervous system is you have the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves. It's what are the two types? Oh God, I'm forgetting this now. The ones that go out and the ones that come in.
Afferent and efferent.
Yeah, afferent, efferent. There it is.
Mhm.
And so we have the peripheral nervous system, which is basically how we're able to understand and receive certain types of information and senses from the rest of the body. So it's not just the core of the brain and the spinal cord.
Mhm.
And so if for listeners, they're kind of picturing all the nerves in the brain, and then outside of that, in the rest of our body, in the uh, outside from the in the peripheral nervous system. So then under that is you have the what is it, the autonomic and the somatic. Oh God, I'm forgetting this.
Got it.
Um,
In the peripheral.
and
Mhm.
and one of them has the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And so basically, the best way to think about that is the sympathetic nervous system is the thing to elevate you to say to be aware of certain things that are going on within your body and the environment. Parasympathetic is the nervous system that is trying to tell you to calm down. So this is the things that we have for how we have to go to sleep, or how we calm down, or how we relax. And so these two are under the broader nervous system.
Mhm.
One of the downsides of talking about this auditorily is that this stuff is always good to look at visually. So it's hard probably for listeners in some ways to hear some of this, but that's the basics of it.
Mhm.
So going back to the brain, central nervous system, which, kind of a cartoon uh, example of this is, the brain is the computer, it's the motherboard for the human body. I mean, that's a okay, I guess, way of understanding the brain. It's not just that, but that will be fine for now. Um, there's all these different parts, and so for the brain, there's the cortical part, which is basically the top layers of the brain, and then you have the subcortical part of the brain. Sub meaning internal, right? So if you think of like a submarine that descends, so the subcortical is the kind of the inner parts of the brain. And the inner parts of the brain is where um, I think probably, I don't know all of the um, evolutionary kinds of uh, progression of this, but in terms of the brain, you kind of want some of the stuff in the interior to be kind of protected,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
and so that goes back to the point. So there's certain things. There's your limbic system, which has to deal primarily with emotions, although not just emotions.
Mhm.
And a lot of our memories are stored kind of subcortical, and there's or the process of translating memories to longer term is there.
Mhm.
And so the hypothalamus is in this very center of our brain, and it's next to the thalamus and the amygdala. And so that's basically um the thalamus is the relay station, right? That's telling you where it goes here and where it goes there. But the hypothalamus is responsible for many I kind of see it as like a crossroads between the physiological aspects of us and our emotional aspects of us. It's not just that, but it's doing different things in the brain in that way, right?
It's
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 hunger, thirst, sex. There's a lot of things that we do that kind of play in both of these kinds of proverbial worlds. And so the hypothalamus is a very, very, it's a small part of the very small part of the brain, but it's super important for trying to get at that. I don't know if there's another way you want to explain it, but that's how
there's
I know.
you did a great job. I would add, it's maybe oversimplifying it, but it keeps things in balance. I
Mhm.
think homeostasis and balance are the keywords for hypothalamus. Like the hypothalamus is the king of
Hmm.
keeping things in check, whether it's through sleep or thirst, like both
Right.
internal bodily mechanisms, as much as the hormonal balances, as much as balances in terms of making the rest of the brain be in balance. So uh, it has a whole lot of functions because it touches upon so many functions. It is really deep down in the brain where we can really
Hmm.
see it when we open the brain, or it's deeper type of structure. So that also means it connects to a whole lot of
Yeah.
other areas of the
Right.
brain. It does not function on its own. It has layers to it, and every part is doing different things. But we won't get into
Yeah. Yeah.
those of details.
So, so go back to I guess the HPA axis. So
So
this is, what is it again?
the hypothalamic, so the hypothalamus,
Hmm.
connects and sends messages. It sends hormones, the releasing factors, they're called the hypothalamic releasing factors, to the pituitary gland, which is also a subcortical structure. It lays right under the hypothalamus.
So just briefly, the pituitary gland is, um, it's not part of the central nervous system, right? It's not part of the nervous system. It's part of the endocrine system, right?
It,
Or
it,
no? Am I
it,
wrong on
it's
this?
both. It is actually
So it's
both.
in
Because
both.
it
Yeah,
has two sides. It has an anterior and a posterior
that's
side.
right. That's
And
right.
one of the sides has neurons, has connections, direct
Hmm.
connections with the hypothalamus, like the axons actually synapse in one of the regions of the pituitary. And
Hmm.
the second half of the pituitary has blood vessels in them. And,
Mm.
and, and then the moment that a chemical goes into the blood, we call it a hormone. The moment
Yeah.
that a chemical it gets released between neurons, we call it a neurotransmitter.
Yeah.
So it is technically anatomically in the nervous system because of its location, but in terms
Hmm.
of function, it serves both an endocrine role, a hormonal role, and a neurochemical role.
I see it sort of kind of. I see it as like a bridge between the two.
Yeah.
And in that way, not quite the same, but I kind of see it sort of like how the liver functions. The liver is a function between the digestive and the cardiovascular system. Although the pituitary is legitimately in both. I think the liver probably functions in the mostly in the digestive alone. I could be wrong on that. But anyways, yeah, it's a bridge. It's a mechanism between the two.
Absolutely. So if we, yeah, and another analogy could be something along the lines, the hypothalamus is the CEO of this whole
Hmm.
system, and then the pituitary is the project manager,
Hmm.
and then all the organs that release, hormones internally, like the thyroid, the ovaries, the testes, the adrenal glands,
Hmm.
are the workers, people doing the
Right.
project.
Right.
Right. So that's kind of like the hierarchy that it takes in terms of roles and functions. So the
And
pituitary, oh, yeah, go ahead.
and then sorry, and then the A.
Mhm. And
So
then
this
what?
the HPA. So what's the?
Yeah, and the A stands from adrenal axis.
Uh-huh.
So we're getting way far away from the brain now, all
Hmm.
the way to our kidneys, and on top of our kidneys we have what's called an adrenal gland. Each kidney has one,
Hmm.
and then that gland has a cortex, an outer layer, and an inner layer. We're not interested for this talk in the inner layer. It has other functions,
Yeah.
but the cortex is very important because the activation of those cells leads to the release of what we call cortisol,
Hmm.
which is what we can measure as the main stress hormone. Basically, it releases what we call glucocorticoids, but
Hmm.
that's the precursor of cortisol, which is more.
So before we get to, I guess, kind of the sequence of this, because there is a sequence of how all this works. So now that we've kind of explained all that, so just tell us again, cortisol is a big player in this. Right? So maybe let's land on here for this one. Tell us what cortisol is, and just in a general sense.
So cortisol is a chemical, is a hormone. We can look at it this way, that has a very wide number of functions in the body. For example, it one of its main one is that it recruits energy and it recruits the immune system.
Hmm.
Um, in case of, again, injury, we're talking about a stress response. So in
Right.
addition to fighting or flighting, if there's injury, we want to heal those injuries, and we want to be able to have enough in our system to carry on. And
Hmm.
that's what cortisol mainly in a nutshell would do. So it gets distributed all over the body since it's in the bloodstream, right? It goes everywhere. And one of the places it goes back to is to the brain.
Right.
So we in my field of research, we're really interested in seeing in how does chronic elevations or um, secretions of cortisol impact back the brain, because technically, it all starts from the brain getting just to cortisol, then cortisol goes back and can have severe effects, detrimental effects on certain brain structures when they're exposed to it for a very long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things, when things work when things are in check, right, those acute stressors, like stress is a good thing. We need it. We need this HPA axis to function. When there's enough cortisol in the system, it's a good thing it goes back to the brain, because then it tells the hypothalamus, the CEO that I compared it to, that, okay, we got enough cortisol. You got to stop.
Mm-hmm.
You got to stop that firing, and you gotta let me do what I'm supposed to do here. Let me heal this part of the body, and then recruit energy, go work on insulin and glucagon and on the metabolism of how foods are processed. And we got to press the brake system. And it presses the brake system. Hypothalamus shuts down what it's sending to the pituitary. Pituitary doesn't hear from the hypothalamus, then it stops sending what it's sending, ACTH, to the adrenal cortex, and then adrenal cortex stops producing cortisol. And we're back to balance, to homeostasis. The whole point of the HPA system is to restore homeostasis.
Yeah. So this is kind of the overarching or umbrella goal, right? Is within, much as in other organisms, but intrinsically within the body, and with, I think you could kind of say, endogenous to each part, there is this, I can't even, goal might not even be the right word. There is this thing that's pushing it to find balance, right? Because if it's too less or too much, it's less functional. And probably evolutionary components of less likely to survive. So you want balance. And so there are very complex pieces here. If people could see these parts we're talking about, these are very small organs. They're very small parts of our body. They're not huge organs, so it's fascinating how there's wrapped up in something so physically small is super important to so many things for our body, which probably by just, I don't say quote unquote design, but probably in the way and how we've evolved is why they're so nested within us, right? So it's less likely to get injured. Yeah. So I think so. You discussed kind of the cycle here, right? Of how this works. So maybe let's use an example here, and we can just kind of walk through the example here. Do you have a good? I can't think of. Stress happens all the time, but I can't think of a good stress example.
You know what? I'll give you our experiment example.
Okay.
And maybe a few people can. But I don't know. This is debatable. This was one of the limitations, I guess, of many studies. Public speech. Right. So being put in front of a group of people, and I'm not talking about people who have phobia with public speaking.
It's just a kind of a general nominal fear of speaking in front of people.
If you were told, like, okay, in the next 10 minutes, so very little preparation, this is important. Okay. You're going to go and speak in front of a panel of people that you actually very, very much respect. And let's assume they're people you care about. That is an important component because of the threat to the self piece that I mentioned before. And you only have 10 minutes to prepare, and it's on this particular subject. You have to convince them, to hire you, for example. Like a job interview would be a good way to put that. Or you have to, tell them about yourself. Tell them about something that is important to you. And then to add a layer of difficulty to that, because some people may be like, it's on, let's go. I love it. Yes, I want to talk to my, to my peers, to my heroes. This is a lifetime opportunity. It causes no stress at all. Well, we would only know if we measure cortisol, because we don't always notice the signs of stress. It doesn't mean the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, is activated. It's not always activated in times of stress. So let's assume that you go there and you start, your speech or your presentation, and they look at you with a blank face. They give you no nodding, no smile, no feedback. They're not rude. They're not, putting you down, but they give you zero affect. So then you inevitably, and this has been shown through experiments and experiments, humans try to connect.
Yeah.
We like to nod, and I'm shaking my head as I'm telling you this. Right? We like to smile. I mean, we in therapy, right? We do
right.
that a whole lot. A lot of our work is
They're signals. They're signals of sorts.
In the nonverbal.
Yeah.
So if we get flat affect, if we get zero nonverbal in an evaluative setting, that has been shown consistently to elevate levels of stress. So that would be a little bit more of a situation tapping on kind of like the social construct of stress, right? Another very more simplistic example, it's a good example nevertheless, is if someone in your family, you hear news that something happened to someone in your family, but you don't have enough details to know what, like something it's bad news. So first response is, oh my goodness, what happened? And you're going to try to problem solve it. Until we don't have the answer, people are okay, we will have a stress response. So I mean, stressors happen every day. Your boss giving you a deadline that is very tight and not having time to do it. It's that idea of the demand outweighs the resources or the time or the things that we think are protecting of our ego and of ourselves.
So in any one of these examples, I guess the public speaking one or some type of discussion or talk or leading something in front of people where there is an evaluative aspect, whether informally or formally, and kind of you were saying there's limited nonverbal feedback that you're given. So then what happens then with the with how stress is working within the brain and the axis that we just discussed? So usually what happens? So we're getting information, we're getting input from the environment, right? Or whatever it is, right? We're not getting affirmations. We're not getting, we can't, sometimes it might have a positive or negative valence, but we're not getting something. And then our brain does what?
Yeah. Well, we can see it as this is a perception of social threat potentially, right? So we have an alarm. There's the alarm phase. The alarm, it's an internal alarm that tells the system, watch out. We don't know for what yet, but our limbic system takes care of that. Like the raw, the primitive emotions come up to be able to get us ready in case of a fight or flight or numb or freeze type of response. So that is enough. And because those neural correlates hug each other in the brain anatomically. They're really, really close in proximity. The limbic components that get activated also tell the hypothalamus, hey, you may need to start secreting a number of hormones, not just the HPA axis, a lot of different axes. So get ready. So then that's it. Those connections start, really working, and then they send the signals to the pituitary gland, to the adrenal gland next. There's a release of cortisol. At this time, we're 30 minutes into the experience, into the speech part. If after 30 minutes we finally get a nod or a yes, or we self-talk. I mean, some people, we are cognitive and rational beings. We may start to have our internal talk. Well, it's okay. I don't even know these people anyway. Who cares if they like me or not? I'm doing my best. All things that are protective in nature. And then that is signal to like, well, it's not a threat. It's fine. I mean, they may not like your presentation, but that's not the end of the world. And that signal, that cognitive signal, which of course gets mediated, and not of course, but gets mediated more in the frontal lobe of the brain. Like that's our rational part of the brain. Goes and talks back to the hypothalamus and says, no more threat. Stop sending signals to the pituitary. The pituitary doesn't receive signals from the hypothalamus, from its big boss. It's not going to do its job, so it won't secrete ACTH. And then the adrenal gland is like, okay, well, no more signal, no more need to secrete cortisol, and then the cortisol levels will eventually calm down. So a typical stress response after the perception element involves an acute response, a recuperation, basically something just kind of mechanism, it's working its way out, and then a decrease, it's calming down. It's creating an inverted U shape in terms of response over time. And within an hour or so, I'm giving approximations. Those things can vary, of course. About within an hour, we're back to baseline when it comes to homeostasis.
So that's great. So I think the one key piece here that I'm gonna sharpen the lens on is there's there's this I think this is true. um this is true for I think a lot of things, but for humans, we're walking around in the world and we're bumping into other things, other organisms, and other people. And we have to make a series of discriminations, appropriate discriminations. This is different from this, you know, and sometimes we will use, what are called heuristics or mental shortcuts that can be not so good, and but sometimes very helpful because we can't do this whole big long process all the time. And when we're placed in a novel situation, or we're placed in a situation that has the potential for um, lots of uncertainty, such as the example we're giving with the public speaking 10 minutes before. Okay, go talk about this and this and this. It's like, oh shit, I haven't prepared. I have no idea what I'm doing. Oh no, right? And there's a appropriate, because the first thing that happens is that we have our emotional
Mhm.
response.
Yeah.
It's not all this other things.
No.
It's almost as if, the emotions they're the starter, or they jump start the car of sorts to say, uh-oh.
Mhm. Yeah.
And in that way, this is where we could probably talk about feelings versus emotions,
Mhm.
but the I'll just say the feeling of, or rather the emotion of fear
Mhm.
is super adaptive in that
Oh,
moment.
absolutely.
And and you could do this with every emotion,
Mhm.
right? Because a primary, not the only, but a primary function of emotions are to help us stay alive, to help us
Mhm.
survive. And emotions are terribly fast acting, as they should be. I would hate to have something happen and then my emotions are catching up an hour later. Like, that's not useful to me, for many things. And so emotions have this ability to me, this makes the argument that emotions, there, there's just two things. Emotions are neutral in the fact that in themselves, inherently, there is no positive or negative. Now, there can be what we do, what our actions are, how we respond, what our body is doing, that certainly have subjectively negative or positive components. But the fear piece of it is, in this scenario, is
Mhm.
adaptive. Imagine if you don't have that, right? You could get fired. You could totally fail. You could, there's all these horrible things, let's say, that could happen. And many times there's another dimension here, which is, okay, well, I feel fear, basic traditional model, basic emotion of fear. And then you have other parts of your brain, kind of what you were saying, that do more of the self talk, right? Which is, okay, wait a minute. Um, your subjective experience, your perception is activating these, is in tandem, I guess you could say, with these emotions. And then at that point, there becomes, again, an internal dialogue of
Mhm.
saying, this is all happening very fast in our brain. And explaining it is taking a lot of time, but we all know this experience. We've all been here, which is, shit. What's real, right? I'm feeling this way, but that doesn't mean it's real. Real in one sense, it's real in the fact that you're experiencing it, but it might not be real in another way, of that people are really thinking this way, or they are making these negative attributions, or the fact that I can't read their facial expressions means something else. And so that way, your emotions aren't prescriptive in making necessarily moral judgments or judgments in any way. It's just saying, hey, something's going on. You should probably check this out. And then, the hypothalamus will get involved and say, okay, guys, let's see what we're going to do here. Okay, we're going to do this and this and this and this as as needed. But before you get to that whole process, this is I think, the importance and the value of a few things. On one level, it's important to understand, as best we can, emotional theory and research to
Mm-hmm.
better understand literal, you know, seconds every day of something that we're experiencing and something we're happening. There's a value in doing that kind of research and a value in doing understanding those things. Secondly, it's important to understand accurately what emotions are doing and what they're not doing, how they're categorized and what taxonomy you place them in, because if you have a misunderstanding of that, you're walking around in the world thinking emotions are negative, emotions are bad, emotions are, and you're making these ways of grouping them or clustering them in places which are not only inaccurate, but could be potentially um, delusional and misaligned, which could be more harmful to you. If you're always thinking anger is a negative emotion, or anger is the thing that's making you, be an asshole, it's not anger's fault, right? It's a neutral emotion. It's trying to tell you something's going on, and that's it. I'll just say before I let you jump in here is the example I give to clients sometimes is um, if so everyone's had this happen, right? I'm sure you've had this happen. Um, if the smoke detector goes off in your house, right? It's really annoying. It's super annoying. And it could just be you burn the bacon and you let it sit too long and the smoke goes up and the smoke detector catches it and it just starts going off and everyone's in the house taking towels and whatever else to try and turn the thing off, and there's no fire, no one's in danger, nothing's happening, right? The only thing that it's doing, its primary job, I guess in this case analogy breaks down, but its primary job is something's happening. You should check that out. You should do something about that. It doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't tell you how to do it. It's just saying you probably should. And that's the function, to ring an alarm, to do something. Now, emotions are complicated. They do more than that, but they do at least that, or primarily that for us as humans. And so I think it's the same way. Emotions don't tell you the how or the why. They tell you, you should probably check this out. It's the neon sign pointing to the fire, right? It's like, hey, you see this over here? That's something you should probably look into. And I think in that way, if you can conceptualize emotions in a different way, in a way that's more neutralized, in a way that's there for you, and a way to help you to understand yourself and things around you in your environment, you can have much better ways of managing certain types of interactions with others and with your environment, and then just kind of how you understand it for yourself. And so there's obviously a complex way of how that works. So yeah. So anyways, sorry, I wanted to get some of that in there to be corrective. What are your thoughts about some of the things I said and everything?
I agree. The only, you're right. Emotions are information. Emotions are helpful. The good and bad is based on language, human language that we put on them, and judgment, right? So we bring our morals into the game and determine what it's because it feels good or it feels bad, they're good or bad, or their consequences are. So I agree with you with that 100%.
Mm-hmm.
Emotions at the core are information,
Mm-hmm.
and they are meant to provide quick information so that we get to a reaction, and the other very, very important role of emotions is that they play an active role in having the new information thing they're reacting to be consolidated in memory,
Yeah.
to remember to
Yeah.
remember the threat or the reaction to the threat. We don't need to go through a fire alarm 17 times to understand or to remember, oh, that's a danger threat. So the consolidation of the emotions and memory is also part of this very important loop, and the hippocampus, which is a structure we'll talk about later, is an active structure involved in that. The amygdala and the hippocampal connections are involved in that. So the other piece that I'd add is that it's valid across species. We're not the only
Yeah.
species who have
Yeah.
emotions. It's just that we
Absolutely.
have been able to express them again through language.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's great. Yeah. So, I mean, this is obviously really good information, super helpful. So, what other aspects of this do you want to
Let's
cover
do chronic. This is all good. Like everything we talked about so far, it's adaptive. Everything is normal. Everything is
Right.
worked just the way it was designed.
Okay.
The way
So when it goes to shit, what happens?
Zebras. And I mentioned zebras because I know maybe you're familiar with the book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's quite popular.
Yeah.
Have you read it?
Yes,
Yeah?
yes. A long time ago, yeah.
So it's one of the books I really enjoy. That does a really good job at presenting all of the science in a book format. And the title is, of course, catchy. Why zebras don't get ulcers? They do not. But it's the idea why zebras and other species don't experience these very toxic effects of cortisol, toxic effects of stress in the animal kingdom. I think it's a very unfair paraphrase to the author, but basically what he's saying is this idea that, well, when the stress and sympathetic nervous system and HPA axis are activated in other mammals, once the threat is gone, they're done with it. They don't sit there thinking about the big bear, the lion has attacked them. They don't go there and just start ruminating on, but what should have and would have and could have done. They go about and, live their life until the next threat comes up and they have to fight or flight again, and the system restarts. And the author's argument is that these systems are meant for short-term use. They're meant to have a beginning, middle, and especially an ending. For a lot of human experience, the system does not shut down. Another way to look at it is that in a car we have we have the engine, we have the go system. You kind of like press on gas and you keep going. Eventually, you have to press your brakes because if you keep pressing on the speed, if you keep increasing your speed, you're going to get into an accident or something, or you're going to run out of fuel as well. And that's exactly what happens to the stress system when it's overactivated over time. And I'm talking weeks, months, and years in some. So that's when it gets problematic. How and why is it that in certain circumstances the system keeps going, and what are the detrimental effects on that? And that's the whole different type of researchers we're looking at health impacts that chronic activation of the HPA axis leads to, and psychological impacts. I mean, the conditions such as depression and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, have now very, very strong scientific evidence that they have HPA axis dysregulation. Their Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal axes are completely out of whack. And that didn't happen overnight, of course. It happened over the course of time. So why this is important, I think, is that we all have these systems that are checks and balances, but we know more and more about the fact that the earlier in human development this system is dysregulated, the harder, if not impossible, it is to save it or to bring it back to balance.
So in another way, if you're exposed to, so we're transitioning from acute stress, which we've been talking about, to chronic stress. Basically, it stores in memory, and that if you are exposed to tremendous amounts of stress over time at a very early developmental period, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, in development, it's going to have it's like if you're building a house and you're trying to build the framing of it, if the framing is rotten or there's some pieces that aren't very good, it kind of works in that way.
Or don't even develop.
Or don't even, there's just not there, right? Right.
Yeah. Then how are you supposed to mediate stress when you're 30, 40, or 50, right? It's very difficult. Now, I don't want anyone to think that there are people who don't have an HPA axis. That's not true. Everybody has an HPA axis, and there are ways to retrain it, to build back some of those connections, and to they're called protective factors, resilience factors, stress management factors. There's a neurobiology of stress management involved as well. But if I am to because this is an incredibly complex and thorough area of research, if we're looking at maybe 3 main effects of chronic stress on the brain. One of the most well documented is the detrimental effects on what we call the hippocampus.
Yes.
Hippocampus is also a brain structure which is hidden somewhere in the temporal lobes, the sides of the brain, and that is associated with the consolidation of memories, with learning, and with that many aspects of emotion regulation. So they've realized that over the course of time, so with aging and with stress, the volume of the structure shrinks. And that's not just an impact of aging. It is positively correlated with uh, too much cortisol in the brain.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's toxicity that happens, means that eventually it's not that it kills neurons. It's a misconception. The neurons don't actually die. They might eventually in the hippocampus, but the connections
Yeah.
between neurons are I guess deteriorated over chronic exposure to cortisol, to the stress hormones. That's one. And then there is a very interesting one, and is the numbing. Is there's a numbing effect of this HPA axis, which means that in some cases it then works the way it's supposed to work, and in other cases it won't.
Mhm.
It becomes unreliable. So while we described in the beginning, we spent a good amount of time saying how it should be. Well, what I'm saying is that when individuals are experiencing chronic stressors, let's move forward. And 5 years from now, after the exposure to chronic stress, in 5 years from now, that axis won't work as well as it did before the exposure to chronic stress.
So
It
there's
may
a
or may not get
yeah,
activated. Yeah.
it's sort of like um I think you could look at any other part of the brain, right? Or excuse me, the body. It's yeah, genetics get involved obviously at some point at this, but if I'm an athlete and I'm running or I'm doing whatever, pick your sport, there's a wear and tear that happens, right?
Mhm,
By
mhm.
certain types of just generally. And then if you have an injury, there's going to be something. You could say the same thing about, a car, right? If it's, there's general wear and tear. It's just use and use and use and use over time. But, if there's an accident or multiple accidents, that's just going to make it worse. And so there's, I think, in generally, kind of what you're saying is that over time, in a normal, quote unquote normal kind of brain, and HPA is going to have wear and tear.
Mhm.
But if you have someone that is exposed to various incidents of stress, and or chronic stress over time, um, yes, the connections at the very least aren't going to be there. And I can imagine that there's some type of atrophy, which is just what normally happens with everything in our body, and it happens in our brain. There's just, you know, cognitive impairment for everyone as we get older.
Right, but more so, right? But
Yes,
in
yes, but more
control,
so.
in comparison to controls, to people who do not experience chronic stress at same age, same level, same demographic variables, there is an atrophy, which is telling because it gives
Yeah.
that this variable a stronger weight. It doesn't have to be. One of the colleagues that we had in the lab at McGill, again, that I mentioned before, her name is Sonia Lupien. She's a very, very well known researcher in the areas of human stress. She conducted one of her many studies, included looking at the effects of final exams on students, something we all relate with. I mean, again, we're
Yes.
not talking about necessarily trauma associated with chronic stress. She really just looked at, well, being chronically stressed in grad school or chronically stressed in undergrad, in
Mhm.
what way does the brain respond to some of these things? And she saw a very close correlation, a very direct effect of the fact that the longer the exposure, the cortisol to those areas of stress, even 5 years of exposure to exams led to a little bit of shrinking of the hypothalamus.
Yeah. No,
Right?
that's
And
not
we're talking
surprising.
about 20-year-olds. We're not talking about,
80-year-olds.
cognitive decline.
Right. Right.
Talking about,
Right. Right.
students. So
Right.
they were fine. No one was hurt or injured in her experience. But this is telling, because now, the big worry in this theme of, transgenerational trauma, of the idea that
Mhm.
trauma gets passed on from generation to generation, which is a whole different monster and, thing we
Mhm.
can talk at a different time. But
Mhm.
is this idea that the earlier the exposure and the more prolonged the exposure is to stress, we now know that some of these connections are, or the diversity of the brain, and how many synapses, like the differentiation of these synapses, the richness, if we want to call it this way, of
Yeah.
synapses,
Yeah.
just doesn't develop without the
Yeah.
appropriate stimulation.
Mhm.
Um, when the impacts of chronic stress occur really early in life, in early care, um, that's when it's really dangerous, because that's when we can see a bunch of irreversible events.
Mm.
Yeah.
So I I have a I have a question here about this, and it's a whole can of worms. And I don't want to go too far down that path because that is definitely at least an entire conversation in itself.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it's particularly salient here to at least touch it, and then maybe we can talk about some of the ways in which it's used in culture and society at the moment. So, tell me uh, the difference here, if there are differences, and what they are between chronic stress
Mhm.
and trauma and or complex trauma, which is, again, that's a whole can of worms. That's a whole can of worms. But I'm asking because partly, I mean, I think that there's the data is the data, but I am sort of asking because you are seeing in society now where that word trauma is used overwhelmingly for things that are not traumatic, right?
Mhm.
Not in a clinical sense.
In a
And it's become a very um I think unintentionally, but it's become a very perverse
Mhm.
colloquialism in society. And so I don't know, how do you think about that in terms of
Mhm.
chronic stress, and and then the differentiation between trauma and or complex traumas or all that.
Well, we're gonna leave complex trauma aside.
Okay. Now, let me
We're
just let me
we're
let me
gonna
just make a statement about that for the listeners. So complex trauma is very complicated, no pun intended, but it's basically where, and there's a lot of, again, I am no trauma expert whatsoever, and there's plenty of people I know that spend their life doing this, but my understanding is that if I come from uh, a war torn country, let's say, and that's trauma, that's legitimate trauma, that's a type of trauma, there's a categorization for that. And then I get in a car accident when I move to the new country. And then my dad dies, 2 years later. Like, there's all of these traumatic events, that there's a series of traumas that happen. I don't know if there's a time frame within that, but that we would call it complex trauma. So it's not just, well, you have one big thing, like let's say, coming from a war torn country, and that's it. In development, I think specifically, but at certain points, there is very strong traumatic things that happen, different categorizations of what we define as trauma, but that they are happening to one person's, and then that will have an impact on their uh, psychosomatic functioning. So that's complex trauma, which it is convoluted, it is complex. So yeah, I don't want to go down that path, but just kind of the
Yeah.
differences, I guess, between chronic stress and trauma in general.
Yeah, so that's partially why I said let's leave complex trauma aside. Because I actually work with complex trauma. That's
Yeah.
a type of therapy I provide, and it's its own topic. I'd love to, in the future maybe we can talk about
Yeah, for sure.
trauma. And it also has there's some debates, there's some disagreements about
Hmm.
what it is, what it's not, etc.
Yeah.
So and I felt that stress is a word that people have been numb to it.
Hmm.
You say stress, like, of course, right? Or there's almost an eye roll, like, oh, who doesn't?
Right. Right.
While eh, everything there's, we talked about it being an adaptive response, something helping us prepare, but it's the exception, it's not the rule, and that's partially because we live in overtly stressed societies. So then trauma becomes more significant. It becomes a severe where we have to
Ups the ante of sorts.
up the end of that sorts.
Yeah.
Yes. So they're completely different constructs, in my opinion,
Hmm.
but they're interrelated. I
Okay.
mean, someone can very difficultly argue that a traumatic experience doesn't trigger the stress response, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But a stress response is not necessarily traumatic on its own.
So let me see if I can say it this way. So all traumas are stressful, but not all stressors are traumatic.
Potentially, yes.
Okay.
I would be leaning
Something like
towards
that.
the yes in that way.
Okay.
Um, uh, with the word trauma, there is a part that has to do with, well, twofold. there's a memory aspect to it, as it is the case for stress. I mean, a traumatic experience gets consolidated and affects memory in a little bit of a different way than a stress response. We bring cognition into the game when we talk about trauma,
Mm-hmm.
because of all the interpretation parts, the again the memories, the way they
Mm-hmm.
come back associated with not just post-traumatic stress responses, but something that is perceived as traumatic. Like, for
Mm-hmm.
example, for some individuals, we can argue and debate about that, a breakup is considered traumatic. And
Mm-hmm.
based on the circumstances around the breakup, a breakup can be considered traumatic. And it can
Sure.
also lead to a stress response. So for me, stress has to do with the biological responses of an event. And that event can be traumatic, just like it can be threatful without necessarily falling into all the categories of trauma.
So, hmm. Yeah, I'm hearing a bunch of counterfactuals here in my head. So how this is a hard one, right? Because how do you have a, I guess, a general or universal definition of trauma if there is some variance depending on the person? No, I mean, a breakup for me, whatever, okay, or I could be beside myself. I'm drinking too much. I can't sleep. I'm not eating. And I'm just completely emotionally wrecked. I can't, and then every time I try to, um, I mean, I'm just hypothetically, I'm obviously married, but hypothetically, if I go to the next person I date and blah, 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 I'm going to be like, oh, I don't want to get the same kind of hurt. Like this stuff happens for some people, but for other people, it's like, yeah, had a bad run.
Mhm.
Okay, let's start over with the next person. Like, I mean, just there's so much variance there. How could you? I guess does this just become a kind of categorization thing? I mean, maybe this is what people debate, but
No, 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 no. I don't think
no.
so. I don't think it's only a categorization, a linguistic thing. I think that
Okay.
trauma has additional layers to it and stress does not. So, with let's think about a very young individual, and we'll maybe talk about some sad stories here. And perhaps it's a good time to talk about maybe one of the animal models of stress and trauma. So,
Okay.
a very young individual that doesn't have language development and cognition is based on their developmental stage. It's a 2-year-old, right? So there are enough cognitions, but not to the point where they have ability to express them or they have the
Yeah.
ability to really understand what is going on. If a traumatic experience happens, there are still going to be long-term effects of that
Hmm.
trauma. And that is because the limbic systems are partially, if not exclusively, involved in that. The trauma is going to be stored in memory in a particular way. I mean,
Hmm.
there's a really good. I mean, I like this book. The Body Keeps the Score. It's also very
Hmm.
famous.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it goes all into that, the way the body keeps the score. It
Yeah.
remembers even when things happen that precede language development and
Hmm.
arguably for cognitive development to a certain
Hmm.
point, right? So that's one way to look at it, and trying to see, well, it's not just a matter of labeling it, it's the impact that it can have and the long-term impact that a particular threat can have on responses,
Hmm.
to the point where we bypass in the future an interpretation of an event. If this was so traumatic, if it was so strong and when it first occurred, we're going to bypass trying to understand it the second and the third time. We're going to go to the reaction right away, and
Hmm.
that typically is characteristic of a trauma response, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, the same
So,
thing go
sorry.
with a chronic activation of a stress axis, right? So, for example, I mean, again, very sad and unfortunate events, but domestic violence.
Hmm.
So, if a child is exposed to parents fighting, or I'm talking about more severe cases of domestic violence, but even verbal violence can be included in that. Like that constant activation of threat, of yelling, of violence, is enough to become a traumatic experience because of its chronicity, of the
Hmm.
activation of that association between very difficult affect feelings that not feelings, emotions that result from that experience, consolidated in memory, and then biological responses that occur as a result of that. That too would be, in my opinion, categorized under trauma. So I don't necessarily agree or think it's only a matter of how we distinguish them verbally or cognitively. It's a matter of what they do to the system long term. And trauma tend to have a longer impact.
Does this mean that it has to be with more in how we understand memory? So for stress, it's both stress and trauma remember things, but are they remembering it in different ways, or is there a different level to it? Or I'm still trying to make sure I understand the distinction. I know there's a intersection there between the two, but I do want to parse out what are the distinctions between chronic stress, let's say, and trauma. So I see the memory component, but I'm trying to really understand the very specifics of the differences.
So there's an area of overlap. I would agree with that. Like if we really extend it to, there may be an area of overlap between chronic stress and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
The way I like to look at it is that chronic activation of the stress systems is going to affect the consolidation of memories about that piece, about the activation of the memory systems and how the systems work.
Right.
It is a biological phenomenon that has impact on brain, on behavior, on responses, on affect. It networks in different areas. Trauma is more layered, in my opinion.
Okay.
Right. So trauma inevitably involves, yes, of course, the memory of the reactions itself, or I just said you don't necessarily need language or cognitions to have a traumatic reaction, but for those who do, it has a metacognitive piece to it. Like we have to make sense of it and interpret it as trauma to make it traumatic. So I just think they're different entities in terms of what types of memories they
yeah.
Like we don't need to remember to breathe. We don't need to remember,
right.
go. There are implicit memories, and there are things that we remember that are automatic, and part of the HPA overactivation gets to be automatic in some ways, right?
Yeah. It still sounds very complicated. I think that, and I know plenty. I mean, there's still things we're learning about it, and I know you and I have other colleagues that have really carved out this part of the clinical world in understanding trauma, because there's still a lot to learn. It's still very complicated, but I think that I like that way of understanding it as, trauma having more layers. And so then again, if you're having many traumatic events, that's just layers on layers on layers, which is, I can imagine, very difficult to untangle and unthread. And I think this is what makes clinical work with folks that have been exposed to different traumas, that work's really difficult. It's really tough work to do that because of the layered piece.
Absolutely. So those terms are, in fact, I'm glad you bring it up, because they are oftentimes used interchangeably. And like I said, there may be like two circles that overlap. Like how wide is the layer of overlap? Right. So in that overlap, they do look and feel and taste and seem alike. It's it's important to distinguish them, because at least when it comes to differentiating it between stress, like not all stressful experiences are automatically traumatic.
Yeah.
People that have gone through trauma have a different sensitivity to stress. Their threshold are just not the same, and therefore that overlap is a little bit wider in that particular case. So that's why it's very tricky to compare or contrast them, because it really depends on the level of intensity and chronicity for each. I mean, it's not really a simple thing. I was going to say it's not really simple, but maternal separation. Yeah, maternal separation. I mean, many animal studies that have looked at ethical or unethically. So, what would it look like for the system when we, separate pups or separate baby monkeys, for instance, from their moms?
Yeah. And
of course, the cortisol was measured along with many other biological markers of stress, and what was, it's just kind of like an oversimplification of these studies, but what has been determined is that long-term separation, like separating baby monkey for 3 months, for 6 months, or 12 months, the longer the separation, the more likely we're talking about a trauma effect of the separation. So you separate a baby monkey from its mom for, a week, that's a stress response. If we are going to measure it in terms of duration. But there's cortisol that gets to be, floods the system. We see behavioral reactions. I mean, the baby stopped eating for a while. They become anorexic, biologically speaking. When they were reunited with mom, they had a bunch of other reactions that we can talk about, but eventually they recovered. They came back to what was considered the norm. They rebuilt their homeostasis. When the other group was separated for 12 months, the effects were irreversible, even when we reunited them with a mom or with another caretaker.
Yeah.
So these impacts we're not talking about, we've passed the stage of stress response, at that level. At this point, we're talking the 12-month separation, after birth and we're talking about complete separation here. We're not talking about, So was associated with so severe impacts on functioning, on social functioning, behavioral, on of course the homeostatic parts of the system, that at this point we're talking about a trauma reaction.
Yeah. And I think that would be interesting too, in terms of there's this kind of blending and overlapping of kind of ethology, the study of animal behaviors, and then evolutionary psychology, because there's this connection piece of evolutionary psychology is trying to understand basically human phenomena that we see in other animals, right? Other primates, and then other mammals, and then other animals, invertebrates, and things like that. And so, I think this is true in terms of maternal separation, I think in dolphins and orcas, right, as well. And obviously in other primates, like rhesus monkeys and bonobos and chimpanzees. And I think the instrumental component there is, well, they're all social mammals. And so there is this, that's one correlatory data point, but you could look at probably other things and you would assume that primates are a little bit closer to us, but not necessarily in terms of certain components. And so that is very interesting in how we can understand things about us as humans in something like trauma or something like maternal separation. Another interesting idea would be, what about other animals that, there's interesting data on this, have, infanticide, or that's how they function after certain types of animals or offspring are born. They abandon some, they neglect them, and that's just a very normal part of how they do things. And it'd be interesting to see all the different components. And so that's for all the evolutionary psychologists and ethologists out there to I guess tackle. But
well, at least in monkey studies and rat studies, on the roles of stress and neglect and early maternal care, and its impact versus no care versus high care versus no care. I mean, these models rooted attachment theory to start with.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's a lot of attachment theory starts to kind of come into this.
I mean, and we're falling into the bracket of the neurobiology of attachment theory, really, because in addition to, yes, there's a social construct to this, there's actually a biological construct to this. The grooming and the physical touch.
With attachment theory, you're saying?
Well,
right?
no, with the development of the HPA axis, and later the attachment theory kind of took that and said that's attachment. Indeed, it is. But the idea of newborns need sensory stimulation, if I'm going to put it this way, and that is achieved through grooming, through the rats and licks their pups. There are routines that they engage in, and they've determined that those that don't receive that, they pretty much lose part of their cell consistencies in those areas that correspond to the stress systems in the brain. So another way to put it at is that everybody, most species are born with more neurons that they need, and then sort of they lose some. Right. What happens with early stages of neglect, because that's a form of neglect, not grooming and not having that sensory stimulation, those pathways are lost from a really early age on. The connectivity between the synapses are lost. So then, even though they may be reunited with the caretaker, say in the first year of life, I'm talking about rat studies and monkey studies, a little bit different in human. Even if though they would be reunited, they've missed their critical period of brain development.
Yeah.
So it's not just social. There are actually biological
Hmm.
consequences of these social separations, and that's where nature and nurture come together. Of course,
Yeah, sure,
we're,
sure, of course.
we're deviating from stress, but
Yeah, yeah. No, 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 no.
it's an
That's right though.
example.
That's right.
It's an example of how the stress axis could be irreversibly damaged in the
Yeah.
first 6 months of life with depletion of stimulation.
Yeah, yeah. And we again, this is starting to bleed into attachment theory, which is, we do have critical periods. And I've referenced this before, I think in other places, but kind of lateral to what you're saying is there's some of Alan Shore's work is that there's the neurobiology and development with attachment, with right hemisphere um, development in the brain for a child, human child, first 12 months of life,
Mhm.
just from facial recognition of mom or
Mhm.
primary caregiver. And you're talking about attachment legitimately um, helping to develop your brain.
Mhm.
And I definitely think that the um, the HP access and then all of the other components in terms of how we manage stress or how we consolidate certain things or how we develop certain resiliency factors is also included in that as well. So you do start to see there's a lot of there's a kind of a network of how all these things connect in some ways. So which is particularly arresting. And so um
Well, there are some good news. I mean, this all sounds very also a little depressing, right? Knowing all the chronic impacts of on stress, but
sure.
it's also a highly dynamic system. It is built to regulate itself.
Hmm.
I always
Hmm.
tell sometimes because I use some of that language, not to the extent we talked about today. When I work with my patients, I like to teach them about what's happening in their body when they're stressed. I think that's very important so we
Sure. Yeah.
recognize signals. And I like to tell some of them sometimes, like, trust your system. It's
Yeah.
designed in a way to adapt. We need to
Hmm.
get it back in check. We need to find a way to reset it, to bring it back to its homeostasis. And of course, there are different therapies that help with that are
Sure.
aiming towards that. But there are things that are known to reduce stress. Basic self-care needs are some of them, like
Hmm.
sleep is one of the things that is most directly correlated with dysregulations in cortisol.
I would, I
One way
would,
or
I
another.
would,
Mhm.
I would qualify that a little bit and probably say restful sleep is
Rest.
probably
Adaptive
mostly
sleep.
there. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So a good night of sleep, like a good 8 hours
Yeah.
is
I can
not
get 9 hours, but if I'm tossing and turning and waking up 4 times, it's like I got
which
9 hours, but it sucked
which
the whole
is
time,
a dual effect. That may be your cortisol. You may be off
right.
track right now.
Right. 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 But
If
there's a
anyone
difference.
has ever woken up 2 hours before their alarm clock and ready and sharp and,
Right.
whoa,
Yeah.
what was
Yeah.
that? That's your cortisol waking you up. It's
Yeah.
probably an effect of something a little bit more chronic. So,
Right. Yeah.
it's something we gotta figure how to, take good care of. Exercise,
Hmm.
cardiovascular exercise is
Hmm.
incredibly helpful because of its release of endorphins, and those things press the brake system, the parasympathetic nervous system. Deep breathing, actually, well, people don't like it, but no, diaphragmatic breathing is a
Yes.
physical way to stimulate the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system and brings the system to slow down.
Right.
So there are things, without going into, of course, tips for how to reduce stress, but there are actual biological and behavioral things one can do to create a sense of balance and it starts with recognizing, what and where people hold their stress. Again, a
Yeah.
stress reaction for one person isn't going to be experienced. It's going to lead to the same bioreactions, but it's not going to lead to the same experience of how we
Hmm.
interpret those reactions.
Yeah. 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 That's great.
Mhm.
Um, okay. So let's shift gears here a little bit and let's talk about the field, kind of at large, and then kind of I think some challenges within the field, in the clinical world, I guess, and then we can hit a few other things. So I've had a few people on that have represented different parts of psychology. I've had handful of social psychologists, some developmental evolutionary psychologists. So I think you're the first person that's a clinical psychologist, which is obviously my world as well. So let's we don't have to talk about all the major differences between them, but let's just start with kind of and how you understand it, what separates clinical psych and its value and importance, and then some of the nuances, and then kind of what's kind of going on, just as again, trying to get a context of things, and then before going into some of the other things. So for you, um, how do you see it? I guess clinical psych and differences, and just broad overview of it.
Well, it's a big question too. The way
Yeah.
I see it, I like to answer this question related a little bit to my personal experience,
Mhm.
and where not again, I won't go over how I got to clinical psych again, but
Yeah.
I come from I studied at McGill University, and uh, at McGill, psychology and clinical psychology was part of the science department. I got a
Physical sciences or social sciences?
no, not social sciences,
The,
part of the sciences. So
the sciences.
I got
Okay.
a bachelor in science,
Okay.
major in psychology. And this is the first time, I think it was one of my classes where the professor started this debate: is it a social science, is it a science? And
Mhm.
I think that can translate now into this idea, well, what's a clinical psychologist? And to me, it's a psychologist, just like the experimental psychologist, that applies the scientific knowledge, the science of psychology in clinical practices.
Mhm.
It I think I got what I needed from the different trainings that I sought to be able to have a good home base, a theoretical and a home base as of what constitutes the science part of psychology.
Mhm.
And with the PsyD approach, without going to the debate of PhD PsyD, but with the clinical aspect of it, so in what way to have those lead to applications,
Mhm.
so that one can intervene when working with people in the here and now, people coming in with we call real life problems, right? With
Yeah.
symptoms, with certain diagnoses. So for me, the field of clinical psychology is the perfect combination of history, first of all, because
Mhm.
one cannot really go into the field, I think, into the field of psychology without a good understanding of the fathers of psychology. A lot of it is rooted in philosophy, as a matter of fact. So
Mhm.
process of therapy was not invented by psychologists; it's invented by other people, right? So
Yeah.
and we but the research nature of it, I mean, has defined the field, in my opinion, from an angle that is really, really crucial. And I'm thinking about all the behaviorists and
Sure.
their research has really brought good emphasis and importance of research in psychology. The cognitive psychologists, the same as social psychologists, have led some of the most incredible studies in the field. And all of that ties up to, well, what does that mean for people in
Right.
the room with you, in the here and now? So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but for me, it's like a fragmented. If you think of the self, right? Think about fragmented selves. Like the clinical psychologist at least tries to bring those together, but
Mhm.
in clinical practice, we try to provide we just kind of have all these hats on so that we can decide on which one may be a better fit for the person who sits with us in the room.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a similar answer. For me, so um, you could do the kind of etymology of it. The psyche is typically translates in kind of the soul, and then ology is the study of something. I think more uh, uh, currently people see psychology as, it's the study of human behavior, right? It's the study of humans, and it's how they behave in the world and how they behave internally. The clinical component of it, excuse me, is interesting. So social psychologists usually look at um, kind of groups of people, or how are humans behaving in certain groups, not exclusively, but they're more interested in the kind of broader sense of it. You obviously have forensic psychologists, which have legal elements. You have neuropsychologists who are focused on brain behavior relations. You have um, uh, people that are individual organizational psychologists, which look at businesses or organizations and how they function. For clinical psych, someone told me one time, they said, clinical psych is like a pair of black dress pants or black slacks, and you can put whatever top on it you want. And it's kind of that way. For me, the clinical piece of it is the essential part of it, right? Mm-hmm. Because the training for clinical psychologists is in theory and then also in the scientific method and research, and then it's the practical application of doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important because you have to understand how a human is working and behaving in different aspects of, I guess, their being. So we just spent an hour and a half where we talked about biological bases of behavior. We talked about neuroanatomical structures. We talked about hormones and endocrine. We talked about all these things. That is a clinical component to understanding a person. That is because of, if you take a biopsychosocial model, which is probably the more current one, you have to understand the intersections in the play that the mind has with the body, with other aspects within the mind and the body. And the training for clinical psychologists is understanding all of those things in tandem, and then how you, as the clinical psychologist, work with many times either research and or treatment for an individual. And that's its power and its use. And so it is, again, working in tandem. But then I would say the biggest thing with psychologists historically in the 20th century, because it's still relatively young in the current state of it. I mean, there's plenty of, like you mentioned, philosophers that were doing psychology long time ago. They just didn't call it that. So the scientific method is very powerful in trying to, how do we quantify data in the world? And then how we are able to have generalizability of that data. So how we have data from a certain sample of a population of people, and then how we can say this applies for overwhelmingly. So it generalizes to people in general, much like medicine does, much like other fields of study do this. That's very powerful. It's not the be all end all, but it's very powerful. And, psychologists do that with different things. I think the other important aspect of clinical psychologists, as opposed to anybody else, I think, yes, even within psychology, is our creation of instruments and measurement of assessing human cognitive abilities, social, emotional functioning, developmental functioning. And we've devised instruments. So I'm explaining and talking about psychological assessment, which is primarily, or 85-90% done by clinical psychologists. So this is, IQ testing, cognitive testing, personality testing, academic, educational, and developmental, neuropsych testing, forensic testing, and where you're using different measurements and instruments that have strong norms and strong statistical validity and reliability. And, even from some of the guys that were trying to look at this, if you look at something like factor analysis, which is a statistical method, that was created by psychologists to try and understand all of the variables to try and get at the underlying variable. You look at path analysis. So even in the world of statistics, right, as a math, right, which is typically seen as a hard science. Of course, statistics is, interesting compared from like calculus or something, but
Yeah.
it is very much a subset of math. That's created by psychologists, because it's like, how do we understand all of these behaviors, and how do we factor in, the 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 golden ticket is, how do we find causation, right? Which is really hard to do, if impossible to do. But there's things like, certain path analyses now are trying to find that and do that, and there's so many ways of trying to there's always a multivariate analysis of things, right? Because humans are complex, and how we understand things are complex, and the instruments that we use to understand cognitive abilities and personality functioning and all the rest I just said, are those instruments were developed and continue to be developed and renormed with the statistic methods that are used by other fields and other disciplines, right? So, that's not to kind of brag about how awesome clinical psychologists are, but the point is to say that there is a very rigorous attempt at trying to, in a scientific way, how to understand ways in which we can quantify the human experience, human behavior in that way, where it's not just a qualitative, no, here's some observations, here's what we think. We see this a lot happen over time. That's good. That's helpful. It's more robust, and it gives it more color, and it gives it more, I think, body to it. But that alone does not help with many aspects. And so I think in that way, when you're trained in that way, then you understand certain pathologies, you understand clinical syndromes, you understand disorders, and you understand many aspects of the integration. And so that's kind of my very long-winded answer of clinical psych, and why it's important. I don't know how you see it.
I agree with you, and I think it's interesting to look back again at history and how the field was first, at least here in North America and United States and Canada. Is this a little bit different elsewhere in the world? In Europe, the credentialing is a little bit different. But the fact that they have in the 40s, mid 40s or late 40s, the Bowler model, the science practitioner model,
Yeah.
was created, and I think that's really, really important to remember that, because it's called a science practitioner model. It was aimed to be rooted in the scientific basis of psychology, and to make it, I think I like what you said about making it measurable, to using objective tools, statistical data, assessments. Now we know, want to have reliable and valid assessments, and norms and all that good stuff is really important. But at the core, that came from that model that was developed, and that gained credibility over the course of time, because that when people work with people, as we do in our field, we have one of the first lenses and at how some of the research applications can impact others.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if someone developed let's look at conditioning, and without going too much into detail, but the classical and operant conditioning theories.
Yeah.
That Skinner, studied with little Albert and its reaction to, white rats and fluffy, furry, objects after that. Like that experiment, that child was conditioned to respond in a fearful manner to a rat, because there was a paired noise associated with the animal. So, every time the rat would be in the room with little Albert, which is a child, there was a bang, a big noise that leads to a fear response. And over repetition and time, that created what we today call a phobia. So, without that very crucial understanding of the science background of what a phobia is, then we wouldn't have the exposure treatments that we have today.
That's
We
right.
wouldn't have the good understanding of why exposure works and doesn't work. And sometimes you can't just get someone flooded with their biggest fear.
Absolutely.
You have to build a hierarchy. So the practitioner part of it is, how do you apply that to the people you work with? And that's where I think, and this is one of the things I think now at this point, I think we all need a little bit of improvement in there, and of better communication between the two worlds, between the science world and the practical world. which is why I'm always excited to see when actual clinical psychologists are also continuing to be engaged in research, which is also criticisms like, well, they're doing research, they're not doing therapy. Well, they're doing therapy, they're not doing research. And I think that gap should be thinner, because if we don't
Hmm.
talk to each other at the end of the day, well, how are those things going to be applied in the same way, in a way that, can actually help the patients?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that that's a fundamental difference as opposed to maybe other disciplines within mental health. And again, it's not a you know one's better than the other. They all have their functions and they all have their utility.
And
They're all
philosophies and
uh, uh,
philosophies, right? Yeah.
yeah. But I think it's very important to know. Okay, certain fields, and we're talking about clinical psych has carved out this part of the world here, and they need to. I absolutely agree. They need to have more of an integration as opposed to just these kinds of
Mhm.
camps. I'll um I'll save listeners to kind of very nuanced um debate, I guess, of between PhDs and PsyDs. They're both, doctors of psychology, or, doctors in psychology. And, but one uses a scientist practitioner model, which is the PhDs, and then the scholar practitioner is the PsyDs. And they're the same in that everything we just said they're doing, they same coursework, same process, internship, post, it's just the same training in that way. I would just say that there's a different emphasis, but it's the same. But
Mhm.
it's in the ways that we're talking, but it's the emphasis is a little bit different,
Mhm.
um, and I think that that's important, to have, again, diversity, kind of viewpoint diversity within the field, and then to say, okay, here's a little bit more of an emphasis on, practical interactions with people as opposed to more research
Mhm.
elements, and both are absolutely needed. Both are, I see them as literally equivalent and lateral. I don't see them as one's higher or lower than the other. So I think that that's important. So okay, so we've staked out kind of clinical psych, and we've staked out kind of its particulars and its utility, and I guess importance. And we haven't really gone deeply into how it needs to interact with other people, such as psychiatrists and other medical doctors and other specialists, and other people in mental health. But generally, we're supporting and promoting that.
Mhm.
But so let's, I guess, talk about. I guess you can tell me what are some of our challenges at the moment within psychology and clinical psych. I mean, there's many,
Mhm.
but what do you see as some of the big ones that are kind of plaguing us at the moment?
Well, um, hmm, I've identified one already. I think when I mentioned just the bigger and the wider gap between the incorporation of some of the communication between the research piece and the clinical piece.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think another major, unfortunately, the politics of psychology have gotten a lot of in the way.
Yeah.
A lot. There's things have become are constantly becoming more and more political, and I'm not just thinking about the roles of all sorts of associations, but the roles of um, mm, even the debate between PsyD and PhDs is
Hmm.
politicized, and I think that
Hmm.
the distractor, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um, there a certain emphasis on trying to over quantify sometimes that I have a little bit of an issue with,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
trying to like look at things that are too specific or too reductionistic, finding like one definition that fits all, or trying to localize one behavior in one part of the brain. Like we're trying to get to
Yeah.
shortcuts. We're trying to get to shortcuts when it's not. That's I always have a hard time trying to address that or explain that, because I typically say, well, how much time do you have?
Right.
It's not a simple story. I mean, there are many. What are your thoughts on it? I can go in either direction with
Well, I'll just
if
say about
you
the brain thing, because that also gets on my nerves. Is, yeah, I think a kind of there's a specificity that almost wants to become prescriptive. So here's the part of the brain that does this specific thing, and you can look at that right in one way, but you can also look at it as, yeah, but you have to keep the gestalt. You got to keep the holistic aspect, because the brain is really just networks of nodes working together simultaneously. So of course you can isolate one aspect and look at it and say, here's some functions, but it's not, one example is, well, um, the cerebellum is responsible for certain aspects of movement. It sits on the back of the brain, right by the neck, actually, right, where it goes down the spinal cord. Sure. But cerebellum is also responsible for many other things. It is the mini brain or whatever. And it's responsible for learning. It's some aspect of memory. Like, people do this with the amygdala. It's like, oh, it's emotions, right? It's like, yeah, it's the seat of emotions, but, and it does a lot, but it's not just that. There's a lot of other pieces to it. And people get really interested in certain areas of the brain, right? So it's like, the frontal lobes do this, the orbital frontal does this, the cingulate does this, and it's like, yes, but they are doing multiple things. And you can give even wider. Left hemisphere does this, right hemisphere does this. Yes, but it is not just that. Can emotions be rational and use cognitive elements? Of course. Can your rational cognitive sign have emotional components? Of course. It's not so parochial in that way. And so there's some of that stuff. Another way of saying this is like, there was a big craze, I guess 10, 15 years ago, at least, here's fMRIs, and so we're gonna put your head in a scanner, and we're gonna see, fMRIs are just functional magnetic resonance imaging, which basically means that you have an MRI which takes a picture of your brain, but the functional aspect of it means we're gonna take a picture of your brain, and it's gonna light up, right? And it looks cool, right? It looks super cool. They're awesome. But it's like, yeah, see, this lights up here and it doesn't light up here. So that must mean this. And it's like, no, it's just telling you this is activating the brain. It doesn't, again, it's not prescriptive. And so I do agree with you that on those things, I'm using kind of the kind of within the neuro field or elements of that within psychology, it does become, again, I think a little myopic in some ways. In terms of political, yeah, so we have we have the American Political Association, also known as the American Psychological Association. So yeah, I have some criticisms. I can share a few. You can tell me if you agree or disagree. So just as a reminder for people, the American Psychological Association is the it's the Association for Psychologists in the United States and Canada, right?
They have this. They have the Canadian version.
They have the Canadian. Okay, sorry.
CPA. But they're best friends.
Yeah, they're buddies. So for APA, the function of the APA, a lot of people don't know this. The function of the APA is to protect the public. So that sounds nice. And that's probably a good thing. The problem with that is they don't protect psychologists. They don't protect students. They don't protect trainees. They protect the public. And that's fine. But there is a need for advocacy and representation and protection for psychologists and for students and for trainees and for many different folks in that world. And this is fundamentally different than, say, social work or I think even professional counselors or the other APA, American Psychiatric Association. They protect their members. And that's not to say that the APA doesn't, but their emphasis or their point is the public first. And so, I could, we talk hours and hours about how there's some really, there is much need for growth in how the APA handles students and trainees at the externship level, at the internship level, postdoc level, in terms of financial compensation and stipends and to placements and all of these things. There's
grievance processes.
Absolutely, whole bunch of things. So I'll stay away from that for now. But I think what happens, what has happened at different points, so it's not novel to now, but I think what happens, especially now, is the APA, in my reading of it, is becoming very trendy. Whatever is happening in society, there's a full task force. There's a campaign for it. There's a, and that's their big thing. And then when that's done and that's not trending, then it's on to the next thing. And so and in that way, there is a strong progressive liberal bias with the APA, and my reading of it and how I see it. So here's a few of the particulars. 20 years ago, there was, right after 9/11, and we're in, Afghanistan, Iraq, it was a little bit beforehand, but really came online there. We're talking about millions of dollars put into research, churning out articles, churning out papers of positive psychology. Let's get this going. We got to talk. We've been talking for, at that point, 60, 70 years, all the disorders, all the pathology, all the horrible things about human beings. We need to do positive psychology. So it was a sort of a very, in its infancy, but the APA got behind it, and it's not propaganda, but it feels like there's some hints of that, where it's like, we're going to pour people are asking, doing IRB process, they're trying to get grants, they're trying to do research on really important things, and all of a sudden, because the mood of the country is in war, and there's a natural or there's a terrorist attack and all that stuff, they're putting all this kind of a political campaign and money into research, and to doing all of the research into positive psychology. And that's where you start seeing the research for mindfulness and meditation, and all of that stuff is fine. I'm not beating any of that up, but it was a big push, and many of the papers put out were very fast and couldn't be replicated. There was very small ends, not a lot of statistical power, but then people were running with the conclusion statements on it. So that's one in I guess in this century. So that's happened. So then some of the bigger ones, and then you can tell me what you think about some of this, is so APA got into some interesting water with torture, with the I think there was with CIA or with one of our government agencies. I don't remember which one. And so we had to, they literally had to like make an addendum to the ethics code of like, yeah, don't torture people ever. That wasn't the case beforehand. But again, it was very politicized on both ends of this. They put out this politically biased guidelines last year, 2 years ago, about toxic masculinity, and how basically defining masculine as toxic, and how there's all these ways to combat that. They've put out a bunch of stuff on diversity, inclusion, equality, which in and of themselves isn't wrong, but they're using only a very small subset of very popular trendy things about race relations now in the country. We weren't talking about this 5 years ago with the APA, at least not in that way. And then this kind of maps on to then how they run their APA conference every year. Every year the top, which is fine, it's not entirely bad, but it's just kind of over your head, pushed down your throat. Whatever is the thing of the moment, they're putting all of that, plenary speakers, all of the workshops, the breakout sessions. It's all about whatever's there. And so it does feel, again, I'm not saying that any of these things are wrong in and of themselves. What I'm saying is that it is kind of just following the trends instead of saying, here's a very prescriptive way of how you want to do things. And again, I think that you can protect the public and not necessarily have to just, coalesce with the groupthink of what's going on in society. And so in that way, the APA, in my view, has lost a lot of its credibility and neutrality by becoming very politicized in these ways. And so this breaks down to guidelines. They're not, directives, but they are guidelines for psychologists in general. It breaks down to how they organize their training programs. It breaks down to how they have their funding. It breaks down to, all of that is a very top-down kind of approach. And that can have, when there's an overwhelming politicization or bias of this, that is not helpful, in my view, and I think potentially inadvertently harmful to people that don't have a strong liberal bias. And it makes it very hard for people that don't align that way to trust the APA. And it makes it very hard for a lot of those things. And then it makes it hard for, as I mentioned in the beginning, that psychologists are like, well, your primary goal isn't for us. So what are we supposed to do? And there's plenty of state psychological organizations that or associations, that are really good, and they kind of do the surrogate side of that. But it's not as robust and complete. So those are some of my qualms. What do you have to say or whatever?
IP is a big monster. I love that you use the terms trust, because that's what it comes down to. I think that again, this is another very, very complex layer. I think it's attempting to do a lot of things, and as most entities, and you're trying to have your hands and your feet in too many buckets, inevitably there are some just can't address well. One of it is really advocacy for trainees, and that's really unfortunate. But when you said trust, and going back to, of course, the torture scandals and the use of psychology in a way that was less than ethical for abort. If people want to read about this, the Hoffman report is available online, and there are YouTube videos that are available and very well done to describe the onset, course, and outcome of the findings that were the tortures. Basically, it was about involving psychologists in interrogations in Guantanamo, more specifically. That's when it happened. So it broke trust in the community. It took decades before, maybe not decades, but years and years before they presented their actual report and consequences of such. And in that time frame, the same people that had approved the implication of certain psychologists in the DoD had stayed in power. And that breach of trust and what it did in an entity that represented, again, power, I think they lost a lot of psychologists as a result of that. And I have not heard or read of things or of signs of trying to get them back or trying to make amends, other than, of course, the publication of the report and taking ownership and responsibility, changing the ethics code. That was all great. I'm so glad to do that. There was no aftermath after that. And trust doesn't just build up because someone publishes an apology in a newspaper and they fire the president and they make a new president. It takes time, and it takes a restructuring from within to be able to pull back people in. It has to be different than it used to be in this place.
Yeah, and I think that way it's just kind of like there's the power dynamic, but it becomes a kind of subculture to its own. And so what you're saying is absolutely right. Apology is great. Changing ethics is great. Removing the president maybe in leadership, that's great. Those are good things and they're good steps, but it's, but then it's like, we don't talk about it anymore. We don't, it's just like, yeah, that was done. That was a period. But, this is something that was happening years and years and years and years. And, I think that it's at the very least incomplete. And I think it's inadequate. And I'm not saying it's all bad, but it's definitely, I think, at least that. So, okay, so we can spend the rest of our time on this next topic. Okay. So, a kind of two-pronged approach here, and then we'll use a fun case example of this. Okay. So, I think in general, with any science, it is the responsibility of scientists and researchers and investigators, is what they're called in research, to be able to honestly, transparently, and tangibly explain scientific data. That's my job, that's your job, and that's everybody's job. It is not and again, that's not a way of saying like this elitism or this ivory tower or this gatekeeping, but basically it's our job to explain to the layman, to the public, to people that don't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt and spend 10, 15 years in school and doing all this stuff. Like, they don't want to do that. That's not what they're there to do.
Mhm.
There is a kind of a sort of an agreement of, okay, this is your field, this is your experts. I don't see it in that way as any different than when I go to a mechanic. I hope they know their stuff. I hope they trust me. I hope, or they're that I can trust them. They're transparent about what's wrong with my car and tell me what's wrong and be fair.
Mhm.
In our field, same thing. And so for scientists, they have a duty, I think, to explain their data, to explain it honestly, to be open, and to explain it to people in ways in which they can understand it.
Mhm.
That's very important, especially when you're talking about human behavior, especially when you're talking about cognitive and emotional uh, experiences.
Yeah.
So, in general, I think that's true. And so we have, how do I say this? Well, this has been around for a while, but it's definitely more harmful and detrimental, I think, now, for various reasons. People and or groups and organizations that are making attempts at doing this in dishonest, intentional or not, ways where misinformation and or disinformation is being spread. And this is what I would see as the self-help, pop psych, motivational, life coach, blah,
Yes.
blah, blah phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I've said it a few times here on the podcast, and obviously with people personally. I'm not a big fan for many reasons. I am a fan of people trying to explain concepts to people in understandable layman terms, and I think that is probably the the most charitable reading of self-help pop psych stuff. They're trying to do that. They're trying to say, okay, how can we get this to someone, that can read a 150 page, easy to read, simple, condensed book or whatever, um, to explain some, you're not going to explain like, yeah, we did this, two-way ANOVA and we found these results with independent. You're not going to explain science in that way to people, right? You have to find a way to explain it, but not lose its integrity. And that's all great. But there is, I think this whole phenomenon, there's the whole economic consumer edge to it too. I mean, you make a lot of money on this stuff, which I hear that. But I see it as threatening in some ways, not threatening to maybe you or I's, integrity or our degrees or our scholarship, but threatening to how much of an obstruction it makes for our work and other people's work.
Oh yeah.
Because you're having to dispel bullshit, and then you're also having to fight against the cookie cutter, short term, microwave answers and solutions to everything, and that's just not always the case. And so it's arming people with misinformation, intentionally or unintentionally, and I think that is very threatening for people, but then also in some ways for mental health professionals at large, but psychologists as well, in many ways. So how do you what's your overview, or how do you see that or understand that?
Oh boy, self-help books. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
well, I'm not a big fan. I have a few I like. I have to say, there are some folks out there that are doing a fantastic job, at making science and psychology be accessible to the public.
Mm-hmm.
And I have all the respect in the world for people seeking self-help books. It's destigmatizing. They're relatively cheap for the most part. They have at least an intention to be rooted in science or what is happening out there. I mean, self-help for anxiety, self-help for depression, self-help for. So I really, really appreciate people's thirst for knowledge. I mean, general population. That's what I refer to. And that idea of I need help with something, and I'm willing to read a book about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
I honor that. I think that's amazing. And that's what makes them dangerous is that they better be good. They better be good to the level where and I respect some of the authors too, because they have a big task in front of them. They want to publish a book that is user friendly, that dejargonizes a certain construct. I hope they want it to sell well, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully not harm anyone while we're in the process of that, right? When I see things like self-help book for complex trauma, which is why I didn't want to get into complex trauma right now because of the self-help piece, I cringe. It's like, oh no, oh no, because if we deal and we've been handling, we've been working through our complex trauma, a self-help book can be a really great start to the healing process, but it can be a really big trigger, a really big harmful factor that can get someone from a relatively stable phase to a spiraling phase. And of course, I always tell people I work with, there's nothing wrong with bringing exercise ideas from a self-help book, and we talk about them and we work through them and we try to apply the other aspects of what those things mean to you. I think my personal issue is that I don't think they're for everybody, and I don't think that they are enough. But I think they're a good start for people who want to learn more about how they can, grow, improve, or heal a particular aspect of their experience. Now, I have a very big problem with oversimplistic self-help, and this idea that basically anyone. We talked about APA before. At least they have some structure. I respect them for that.
Yeah.
I like to say anyone can write a self-help book.
Right.
And oftentimes, people from the field do, create and write their own self-books. There are some that are excellent out there that are rooted in theoretical frameworks. For example, the ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, have a number of self-help books that were created by the creators of ACT themselves. Like, okay. That's fantastic. Like I want to read as a therapist. I want to read those tools to see which ones I may be able to use in my practice or not. So yeah, I have a lot of feelings about self-help books too. I just don't want to demonize them because I realize it's sometimes people's first attempt towards getting some of the help that they probably need and knowledge about a particular subject.
Yes.
I
agree with you.
Disagree. You can disagree.
I do agree with you. I diverge a little bit here though. Yes, it's a good look. People are going through really hard times internally and externally, and trying to get, I'm not trying to demonize the attempt at trying to get help in whichever way is adaptive, I guess. And I would say mostly it's a net positive, but I mean, I've been doing clinical work for 15 years. You've been doing it for a long time as well. Two things come in when I see a client. I want tools and techniques, and here's all the things I read in a book or did in a workbook or saw a YouTube video on. And I'm spending a healthy amount of time, usually early on, having to dispel all that.
I agree.
And so it's like, okay, I get the attempt, I get the effort, I get the motivation and it's a good starting point, but intention isn't everything, and it can be very harmful. And I find more and more that a lot of the times people, when they come for psychotherapy, they want the verbal part of what a self-help or workbook does. And it's just, that's not what therapy is. That's not what it is entirely. I would say that. And or it's correcting misinformation. Again, I don't think that's most people's intention, people that write this stuff. And I definitely don't think that's what folks are trying to, they're trying to just find all the ways that something is right or wrong. I think they're trying to get help. So I agree with you in the spirit of it, but I think in the pragmatic aspects of it, it does become really or potentially harmful because of the misinformation, I think is the biggest thing for me, whether that is intentional or unintentional.
Right, that I have big issues with, and I agree with you. I've had that experience too, where I spent a considerable amount of time correcting and re-educating.
Yeah.
What's in a self-help book, and there can be a lot there. And once an idea or a thought is rooted in reality, like this is what the book says, therefore it is true.
Yeah.
It's extra hard for me to be able to do my job. And like, I'm not starting from zero, I'm starting in the negatives, where I have to
Right.
let's get you back to where these thoughts, these pieces of knowledge have influenced your way of thinking and doing. We got to undo that so that we can start building
Yeah.
up. That I think is incredibly damaging, especially when they're perceived as the an entire truth. And one of the things I am very upset about, passionate about, is adding an credential to give power to a book.
Yeah.
Doctor such and such. All due respect for the people's credentials, they got their degrees, they work very hard for them.
Right.
There's power that comes with that.
Yeah.
There's authority that comes with that. And there is a level of making it be even more truth or more important because such author that has so many, this amount of books or self-help books published, and this other author that has is an MD or a doctor, or is a doctor such and such in front of their name, it does not mean their book is good.
Right. Yeah.
There are many things that make a good book, but that the title in front of it, that's not necessarily good.
Yeah, and I think again there's a whole variety of factors that are going into that maybe that's the author's intent, maybe it's the publishing people, maybe it's the marketing stuff. There's a whole bunch of things. But right, I'm with you on that. I think that's potentially misleading and unintentionally harmful. Yeah, I agree. I think it's very difficult, and I think there's the kind of bigger notion of when there's a lot of that, it does have some cultural opinions about what psychology and what therapists are.
Uh-huh.
You see this in films and TV. All right, whatever, fine. But and then when you're having books and all that, it has a certain kind of farcical kind of nature to it. It's like, oh yeah, psychologists are just kind of a bunch of couple bullet points, feel good, blah blah blah. There's no science to it. It's not legitimate. There's a lot of that, and that could be not true. But again, you get millions of copies of books sold, millions of money put into this, self-help, motivational, whatever. Or I have many people that will tell me, yeah, why would I go to a therapist? I just go to a life coach. It's like, yeah, because you're equating the two as the same, and they're not. But if you read a lot of this material, you would think they are, right? Or just watch a YouTube video, and again, there's nothing wrong with those things. They have their place. But when they're confabulating with certain things, that is, or with the field, that is, again, that's harmful. It's misleading. It's disinformation. So, okay. Remind me. So,
and I want to add to that. It's potentially overly stigmatizing of getting help.
Yes.
I think that's part of the nuance that I really want to emphasize. Like it can be destigmatizing. Like, well, I'll just get a book and from Amazon, delivered at my door. No one sees me reading it. I may learn a few things from it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily foster or encourage that seeking help idea, that idea of seeking help, right? It's like, well, the book will be enough, or will be giving you the tools you need. They sometimes claim things that are not exactly accurate, which comes back to the harm piece that you were mentioning. So I think that's
that there's a globalizing of it, or there's an absolutist element to it. This is all you need, or whatever. And I think that's where it starts getting messy, and that may again be publishing, marketing, PR, but it still is. It's a sensitive thing in that way in our field, because you're dealing with people's their psyche, their emotions, and we have to be very honorable to that.
Yeah.
So remind me to end on a positive note, because I want to spend a little bit of time I know we've been going for a little bit, but I want to spend the rest of the time using an example of this. And I want to hear your thoughts. I have plenty of thoughts. And just as an example of what we're saying here, but then we can kind of tie it up and land more positively. Okay, so we've talked about this a little bit before offline, but one of the biggest self-help individuals is Brene Brown. And she is widely popular. For listeners that don't know, Brene Brown is I don't know what she even titles herself. I know she has a PhD in social work. I guess she's a social worker. I don't know what other title she uses, but she's at least that. She's written at least half a dozen books, maybe more. All of them sell millions and millions of copies. I think she has a podcast with huge people. I think President Obama's been on her podcast. I mean, she has huge people on her podcast. She has not an organization. What would you call it? Not a company, but a program called The Daring Way, where she trains people in like a 12-week, 16-week. Here's how you can do the Brown Daring Way to then go and interact or help other people. She has one of these. I've known a few people that have done this. Yeah. So, I mean, she's got books, she's got a podcast, she has I don't want to call it a training program. It's not a certificate program, but it's a program, and widely popular. People, I don't even know, people that come to me and they're just like, have you read this woman? I'm like, yes, I have. What do you think? Or whatever. She has big reach. So she is probably at the moment kind of at the top of all the self-help stuff right now. So that's kind of the background. So I mean, I want to hear from you about this. I have my opinions on her, but let me hear yours first. If you want to tell me, what you like, criticisms. You take it however you want, but I'll save mine after yours.
Well, I will start with what I like, and I think she has a lovely personality. I will add that she was or used to be or may continue to be a professor at one of the universities in Texas in the Department of Sociology, and that was her start until she started publishing some of the books, some of the famous books that people know. I have not listened to all of her podcasts. I have listened to some of them, and she's a great lecturer. She has a very cool style. She's very relatable. And I think one of her biggest strengths is that she has found a recipe that speaks to people.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's uncontestable. I mean, I didn't know about her as I was writing, because she and I are interested in similar topics, which is shame. And as I was studying, this is part of my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation. It wasn't the main topic, but it was one of the variables I was looking at. In my entire research, I had never heard of Brene Brown. So when I heard that she published all these books and people refer to her as the authority on shame, I got curious. Yeah. And that's when I started, having some of the opinions that I'll share. I got curious, and then very quickly I got confused, then I got disappointed, then I got angry about that some of the things that are, in my opinion, very poorly represented. More specifically about perfectionism and shame. And then I, out of curiosity, because I also like to speak the same language that, the general public speaks and the clients I work with sometimes bring up her books and, refer to them. I decided to read them, and I had a very, very hard time finishing them. It was because of the writing style and because I felt like they were not really going anywhere. So that's just my introduction to Brene Brown. It seems to be, a very, very good speaker. People really love her, and I want to absolutely respect that. But from a clinical perspective and a theoretical perspective, I disagree with a whole lot of what she says in her books.
So maybe, yeah, just kind of very loosely or broadly, if you're able to, just kind of chart out her framework of how she does shame and understands it, and then, and then kind of hit it from that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't tell you how she understands shame because it's very hard to understand. I'm sorry, I can't do that. Yeah, that's one of the issues. Is
Okay.
that I feel like it's not clear.
So what are some of her claims then, I guess, about it?
So there are a lot of examples. There are a lot of personal examples, and there are a lot of promises in the beginnings of the book. If we read this, we want to learn how to be brave, how to be courageous, and fight shame. And I'm, of course, oversynthesizing, and identify your shame, and which that has some value. Call shame out, because otherwise it will grow and it will grow bigger. It's actually something valid that I do believe in. But it's this matter of building up towards an answer for people. People want to hear about shame and vulnerability, which are her two of many main topics that she, uses in different ones of her books. And you're reading, and it builds up and it builds up, and then it falls flat. And that's some of the criticisms that I've read. Also, that some of the people that have read her books are like, well, I was waiting for it and waiting for it and waiting for it, and it never got to the point where what is shame, and what are the cultural impacts of shame, and how are these things, mediated and played out in different scenarios. It almost always comes down to her personal experience, which is one of the things I have most issues with. A lot of her writing is centered around how she overcame a personal experience, and that may be relatable to a lot of people, but I just don't think it's the best way to operationalize a definition and to make it be relatable to other people. It makes it a little bit more centered around the author than around the clients that we work with. And in my eyes, the philosophy of what we do is we do it for other people, not for ourselves as much.
Yeah. So, okay. So your main criticism is that she doesn't give a operationalized definition of shame. There's no payoff or really any, it doesn't land anywhere about shame. And then there's maybe it's a style, a writing style that maybe you just personally don't like, of this overemphasizing of, or leaning on lots of autobiographical narratives that are that has a place, but maybe it's just overused or leaned on too heavily. So it's just too much from her perspective on this stuff, and less again operationalized or broadened. Okay. So what else?
To tell on that, it's not just about the stories, because those can be narratives. A lot of other authors use vignettes, for example, or fictive examples, so that they can illustrate a case or a particular point they're trying to make. The other thing that I find overemphasized in the books that I have read from her is her overemphasis on her years and years of research in the topic. So of course I was curious to read the research, and I had a very hard time finding it. I did find one of her publications, but unlike other authors like Kristin Neff, for example, which I do like, she's one of the authors of, do you know Kristin Neff? So she is also a university professor, and she's very big in the field of self-compassion. And she also has a number of very, very popular books that have been published. But unlike Kristin Neff, when you look at Kristin Neff's biography and CV, just pages and pages of publication outside of the books that are sold in the libraries. We're talking about text chapters and research and whatnot. So one of my criticisms of some of Brene Brown's style in writing is that there seems to be over attempt to back up some of the things that are in her book by the statements. In the many years of research that I have done, this is what I found. Years and years of research of shame. And I don't contest the fact that she has done years of research in shame, but that it doesn't lead to I don't see the publications that
Mhm.
support that research. And to me, when I read that, it sounds like a statement that tries to put a lot of weight and emphasis on something that's about to say to give it credibility. And I have
Mm,
issues
mm,
with that. That's
mm.
piece where we're talking a lot about the self, and we're talking about, I'm a doctor, I'm a doctor, I'm a doctor. Now, if I said that a few times on this last guy, I'd get annoying, right? It'd get,
Yeah,
well,
yeah,
we got it.
yeah,
You're a doctor. You're
yeah,
a doctor.
yeah.
Chill. You're a doctor. So, and I'm not telling Brene Brown to chill or anything like that, but we don't need that much. Those
Mhm.
as many statements say, I have research in this. I've done research in this. Like we know, we got it. Get
Yeah,
to it. Get to the point.
yeah,
And that's the problem. It doesn't get to the point.
yeah. So I think that's a helpful, that last part which you said, because I was thinking about all the counters again to what you're saying. It's like, well, I mean, okay, so I mean, she, um, your criticisms aren't really about the content. It's just all of the window dressing about her. You don't like her writing. You don't like her style. You don't like all her examples. You don't like that she leans on her credentialing, her research. Like but that's not about content, right? Those would be the counters. But I think the last part of what you said is right. Is if you're over or seemingly overcompensating, or you have to say that too many times, that does at the least leave question marks about the authenticity of some things. So I would agree with you on the last point. Okay. Any other points?
For me, a lot of research means a lot of publications.
Yeah.
And if you say that many times, you got to back it up. And I
Yeah.
did not find that backup.
Yeah.
So the ethical problem I have with that is that when you put the word research in front of something, it gives it power. And then when
Hmm.
people read that in the very, I agree with you, question of taste. What I don't like, other people can like.
Right.
Well, when people read that, it's like, well, this means if this piece of paper has a lot of research in front of it, it means it's valid. There's a
Yeah.
causal effect to the validity or to the generability of the construct itself. Now, take a word like shame and vulnerability that triggers a lot for people. I think this is a very complex construct, and also one that everybody can identify with and is curious about. And we see lots of years of research, but that's actually not planned out in publications in peer-reviewed articles.
Yeah.
Well, someone can run an experiment for years, and someone can study a theoretical framework for a year, can do that type of research. That's where I think it's really important to nuance what exactly you mean by that, and not use a word to become an overarching power over the construct that you're selling.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
How
So
comes responsibility, and that's the part
right.
that I have a hard time with her work.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. I agree with you on that. I hear you on that. It's there's an authority that's implicit and explicitly stated for her that doesn't really seem to be there.
Mhm.
That again doesn't mean she doesn't have a doctorate. Doesn't mean she can't call herself a doctor of sorts. Doesn't mean she can't. Maybe she has done her own personal research. No one's saying any of those things, but it's the again, this is going to go to my major point I was saying earlier, is that there's a kind of misleading component to it, right? Like, here's all the research, and then it's like, where? Well, just believe me, I'm a doctor. And it's like, yeah, sure, but the doctorate title is just it's a heuristic, and B, it's a bridge of trying to get at what information you have access to and how you synthesize that. You throwing that word around a bunch of times does kind of loses its value and becomes pretty void. So I would agree with you on that criticism.
Mhm.
Okay, did you want to add anything else, or do you want me to jump in here?
I mean, I can let you go next. I mean, I have other issues with the
Okay.
simplistic and reductionistic way to present something, and the whole idea of pop culture around it. I mean, we can go in any direction from here.
Okay. So um, I'll tee this up a little bit. That
Mhm.
just bear with me, because I have a whole thing of this. So let me I'll launch into this. Okay. So I'll do the same thing with you. I'll start with strengths. I think it's completely admirable that she's trying to have a broader discussion with general population about psychological concepts, especially very difficult ones: shame, empathy, vulnerability, you know, do I get excited or happy that people that never would look at that stuff are watching a TED talk? Absolutely. Some of her kind of videos that she's put up, maybe her podcasts. Like, I think the spirit of that is really helpful. It does destigmatize. People have conversations about it. There's a lot of that makes me very happy, right? And I think that's good. I think that is good, and I think you're right. She's very engaging. She has a nice style. She's relatable. I agree with you on that. That we need folks like that, and people are, however she's coming out and whatever she's saying is resonating with people, and I think that's really good. To the particulars, she has some really good. She has the idea. So, for example, she has more or less, a good understanding of saying, hey, shame and guilt are different, right? Two self-conscious emotions, social emotions. And here's how they're different. I think she mostly gets that right. I think she talks about definitely some of the facets of shame that can be very detrimental to the sense of self. I think she more or less has a general idea of that, which is fine. I do think that some of I've read two of her books. I think one of them is, does have um, literature in the notes section and the bibliography section of the book, and from peer reviewed journals, and they're not they're not from kind of crackpot journals entirely, right? They're from legitimate places. So okay, there's some of that there. So all of those things I think are really, really good. And I think we need more and more people like that are having large conversations with the general population about psychological construct. I think that's a nice. I've said very nice things about her, right? I was very fair. I can see them,
Yeah.
right?
I almost think you're a fan.
Okay. So that being said, I think overall, I think she's a charlatan. I think she's selling snake oil, and I think she's completely misinformed. And I think that she does a lot of disservice to mental health professionals and to people in many unintentional ways. So that's my counter.
Nice. Very cool. Okay.
And now I'm going to tell you why.
Mm-hmm.
Before I do this, I'm going to do a very brief overview. So, because this is important. So, like Simona, or maybe more so than you, I guess, my dissertation, and it was empirical. So we did an actual study. It was in small n, but empirical research. It was on shame. Like that was the central thing. So I spent 3 to 4 years, reading everything I could on the emotion of shame. I did that understanding it as a construct, understanding it as an emotion, understanding it with different populations, trying to understand it within emotional theory, trying to understand it with different clinical syndromes and diagnoses, and spending time in the literature, right? Like in the scientific literature, current research at the time in the literature. I have however many hundreds of pages in my dissertation of all the sources I used that were 90% from scientific journals. So here's the basic differences. We have 6 basic emotions. This is the standard view of emotions. There's some, we're continuing to learn more things, I'll put it that way. But the standard view of emotions is 6 basic emotions: fear, joy, disgust, sadness, anger, surprise. Around, what is it, 3 years of age, we start to develop the social emotions. The 4 basic ones are guilt, shame, embarrassment, and pride. And the 2 subsets of pride: authentic and hubristic pride. Shame is distinctly different from guilt. So shame is the sense of when something happens that we understand our sense of self, that we look negatively about who we are as an individual, our self-concept, who we are, how we are, that we have negative valence or attributions of that. We feel that sense of shame is that kind of the image is wanting to just crawl into the hole in the ground and disappear because we have so much shame about who we are, right? Guilt is more action based. I stole a candy bar from 7-Eleven. I feel bad for it. I should do something. The research consistently shows that guilt typically leads to reparative action. So I steal a candy bar. I feel bad. Let me go and return it. Let me do some community service. Okay, whatever the legal system says, let me pay a fine. Like I want to fix it. That's one example. If I tell someone something wrong or I call them a name, I feel bad. I feel guilty because I did something. Let me apologize. Let me say I was wrong. How can I make it up to you? Shame is, oh, I did this or something happened. I'm a horrible person. This is about me and I can't fix it. I can't repair it. And so shame leads to more anger because I feel like I can't fix it. I can't repair it. So I feel angry. You can experience, and there's more overlap. There was a big meta-analysis study, it's like Kim et al. 2011, I think it is, where they did a big meta-analysis of guilt, shame, and depressive symptoms. And shame overlaps more on depressive symptoms than guilt does, which is not surprising in one way, because what we understand about depression is people that feel hopeless is a symptom. Hopelessness is a symptom of clinical depression, as is irritability. And so if shame is leading to anger or feelings of powerlessness, it's not surprising then that shame would overlap more with clinical depressive symptoms. That's not to say guilt doesn't, but that shame does more than guilt. And so you can also feel shame in terms of privately and publicly, and that really the main difference is there was a big study that was done. They have 4 sub studies, and it's been replicated, where you feel you feel the emotion of shame, but the public aspect of it is what activates it. Is the best way to kind of describe that. And so there's a distinction. Shame and guilt are different. Shame leads to more anger, powerlessness. Guilt leads to more reparative action. But as we said earlier, and as I've said to many people, and I've said on I think the podcast before, emotions are neutral. They don't have a negative or positive valence in and of themselves, right? So you can't say shame is the bad emotion, shame is the negative. I mean, you can say that, but you're wrong, right? That's not how emotions work. They have adaptive utilities, all of them: jealousy, regret, remorse. It may seem counterintuitive for us because of how we interact with them or how we handle them. But the emotions itself, right? It's the smoke detector. It's telling you there's something, do something, right? It doesn't tell you how, it doesn't tell you what, but it says you should check this out. Shame is the same way. Something has occurred. You're feeling this way about yourself. Okay. In fact, the research also shows, I did look this up a little bit before this conversation, some of the more current stuff, is that shame can work as an interpersonal commitment factor, right? So that if I feel a sense of shame, it can then produce or potentially produce a way of how can I be more committed to somebody else? How can I not do that again? How can I understand my personhood and my interactions with another person? And so shame can sometimes, in certain situations, motivate one to act more pro-socially, right? I don't want to do this. I don't want to be that guy. So let me try and do it different. There's another big meta-analysis, with over 12,000 subjects altogether from the 90 studies shown that, again, it can lead to more shame positively linked can have a more constructive approach, right? and that if to try and repair in some ways, not repair, but you can try and have a better understanding of, yeah, I failed or I'm a failure. But sometimes shame, it's mixed, right? It can be both. Shame can sometimes lead one to say, I feel like a failure, so let me work harder to not do that. And other times it can do the opposite, right? It can say, yeah, I'm just a failure and that's how it's going to be. There's plenty of research that shows that shame is more adaptive at the individual level, and that guilt is more adaptive at the interpersonal level. Again, there's differences between how these function within social groups. Shame can sometimes motivate people to have empathy towards others. It can have, better engagement of motivation and behavior and overall pro-social interactions with people. Because it can doesn't mean it will, right? But it definitely can. It has, the bottom line is shame has adaptive qualities for ourselves and for other people because it's working as an activated agent sometimes. That emotion is working that way. So now let me just, some of it's out of context, so I don't like usually doing this, but let me just read, there's a big, in Brene Brown's book, Daring Greatly. This is a quote. Let me read this. Guilt is just as powerful as shame, but its influence is positive while shame's is destructive. We live in a world where most people still subscribe to the belief that shame is a good tool for keeping people in line. Not only is this wrong, it's dangerous. Shame is highly correlated with addiction, violence, aggression, depression, eating disorders, and bullying. Researchers don't find shame correlated with positive outcomes at all. There are no data to support that shame is a helpful compass for good behavior. In fact, shame is much more likely to be the cause of destructive and hurtful behaviors than it is to be the solution.
Wow.
So, this kind of language is inaccurate, unscientific, and fucking abysmal. Because you're going around telling people, and people have bought millions of copies of this fucking book, saying that shame is destructive and there's no positive aspects of it at all. Definitive, absolute statement. I just outlined and detailed in the literature. I can post it in the notes of this podcast, all of the scientific data, all of the meta-analysis studies that have been shown. This isn't one study. This is the consummate studies that have shown how shame has pro-social adaptive qualities. And of course it would, because emotions inherently are neutral. Her depiction of shame is not only inaccurate and wrong, it is horrible because what it is doing is it's spreading misinformation about a fundamental core social emotion because she wants it to fit within her ridiculous framework of how shame does and doesn't function. To say she's painting the lines that shame is the bad emotion and we got to do away with it. And the way we do away with it is we have lots of empathy and we make ourselves vulnerable. And that's again, I haven't got to the empathy part. She has a completely dishonest and misinformed understanding of empathy. Empathy is a very complicated emotion, and it has a different taxonomy than most people think it does. It probably fits under an umbrella of compassion with other different types of emotions under it. It is layered, it's complex. Again, I'm fine with somebody wanting to make a self-help book. That's okay. But if your self-help book is absolutely wrong with the scientific literature, and people are going around having an idea that when they feel the emotions of shame and they're seeing that as a negative thing, that is far worse than the opposite. And especially if somebody comes in for treatment and you're having to spend a considerable amount of time dispelling this notion that shame is a destructive emotion, that to me is harmful.
Yeah.
That to me is fucking abysmal. There's no other way to say it. And your critiques are fair. Your critiques about her credentialing, about her research. Like I said, I spent 3 to 4 years doing this research. Her name didn't pop up even as on, author number 24 of a long, big study. I didn't see her at all. I didn't see her at all. I don't want to hear, I'm a scholar, I'm an expert, I'm a doctor, throwing all these things around when there's nothing there to support it. And that's just not the case. And so she's leaning on that, which is, again, unethical, I think. Mm-hmm. And second, the content of the emotion itself is completely wrong. It's completely wrong. And people aren't going around reading this and buying it. And she's having all of these big talks, having podcasts, having books sold, spreading around information that's completely not commiserate with the scientific literature. And that could be potentially harmful for many vulnerable people. I mean, there's almost like this kind of projection almost that's going on. And that to me is the biggest issue with this. And that is the reason that gets me animated, is because it is spreading misinformation in mass. And that is more problematic, than just ignorance. And so I'll stop there, and you can jump in here.
Well, you're passionate about this, but
yeah, this one is passionate for me. Yeah, I'm passionate about this one.
I have the same frustrations. I mean, in a different quote that I didn't underline, she was making an inference on how when people are shameless, the lack of ability to experience shame is associated, means they're sociopaths. And she actually uses that term. It's like, whoa, we have no background on sociopathy here, or psychopathy, or any of that. So it's reductionistic. It's simplistic to the point where you're right. It's false. It's false psychology. And not only that has a tremendous negative effect on people reading that, taking it face value, because again, I'm passionate about her credentials and about the lack of research, actually, of publication. Someone's doctoral research is valuable, but that doesn't makes them a researcher, in my opinion. A researcher is a person doing research and publishing research and contributing to the field of science and adopting the scientific method, none of which I found evidence. I'm happy to see the evidence that she has. So add the research power. It's the white lab coat effect. Put the white lab on Brene Brown and have her say whatever.
Right.
And people like, you and me and others that have studied shame, or that have studied perfectionism. I mean, she does a little better on perfectionism, but not great. Vulnerability, again, too many monsters, and very few of them actually have scientific accuracy that can be backed up with research. That can lead to not only tremendous shame in people, because in the quote, I cringed again when I heard the quote you read. I remember it from the book, because I thought of, no, what if someone with one of these disorders reads this, right?
Yeah.
Like, it mentions alcohol problems and eating disorders, and oh no, they're going to think they're defective. They're going to think a whole lot of things about shame, and guess what that does? Makes the shame grow exponential. And that is not just harmful for the literal piece, it's harmful for the clinical piece. And that's why I have such a big issue with part of how it's presented to the public. As an FYI, self-help authors don't want her in the self-help.
Oh, that's not surprising.
They're like, it's not. We actually have worksheets in there. So, and all due respect for worksheets, lovely tools. But so saying that there's even a little bit of debate whether it belongs there or not in the big bucket of self-care. It's not exactly agreed upon. So major problems with it. And in the grand scheme of things, what happens when masses believe this kind of pop psychology, this kind of of inferences, my concern is that it decreases trust in the field as a whole.
Yes, absolutely.
With, really spending some time talking about the scientific basis of clinical psychology, and this is why I hang on to that even stronger, because that's why it's so important to root our clinical practice on scientific basis. Because when you don't do that, you end up with inferences like the ones you've read. You end up with the bias that has come and has been criticized in science. This is true because I believe it and because I tell you to, because I have the power to tell you to.
Right.
That's not psychology. That's not
no,
counseling.
no. And I've talked about this elsewhere before, is that I spent, I've been published, and I spent time researching, I presented on this stuff, and I still have this epistemic humility of, I don't know. Like, I got to figure this out. I still don't know. Like, I feel confident about it. But if someone were to say, hey, what do you think about this and this and this? I'd be like, wow, okay, let me consider that. And if it holds up, I'd be like, yeah, I need to rethink how I don't hear any of that from her. I'll read one more piece, and then we can, kind of tie everything up. There's a section, I'm not going to read the whole section, but there's a section on how men and women experience shame differently. So now she's making gender differences. And she has this whole.
I have an article in front of me about that.
So there are certainly differences between men and women, but she's going on about how it loads very negatively with women, and she's giving these anecdotal experiences and all of that. And so, I'd encourage people to read it, but this is how the concluding paragraph of this section. What I've come to believe about men and women, now that I've studied both, is that men and women are equally affected by shame. And I read that, and like, I can understand people's process, and I can understand their evolution and how they grow and they learn things. But the fact that you would think a human emotion is going to be fundamentally different in men and women is ridiculous. How could you come with that assumption? Sure.
Embarrassing to have to write it, right?
It might manifest or might present a little differently, because yes, there are differences between men and women, but her underlying point is that the emotion of shame itself, she thought was and I'm reading this, I'm like, do you have, in one sense, I feel like she has somewhat of an understanding of what shame is. This kind of goes to your point about the definition. Yeah. And in other aspects, I don't think she knows what the hell it is. I think that it's one of those things where, and you're spending, millions of people are reading your book, millions of people are doing this stuff. And it's like, I don't even have a clear idea if she really knows what it is. I think she knows pieces of it, but not all of it. And you're trying to talk about something very sensitive for people. And I think that that's the point. So I stand by what I said. I could go on and on and on, but I stand by what I said in the beginning, kind of the positive aspects I think she does. But for me, she's a step below Tony Robbins, in my view. She's a motivational speaker making a buck, and cool, she connects with people. But I don't see her as any more in terms of presentation or how she's spreading her certain system as any better than someone like that. Big motivational speaker, life coach, blah blah blah. Not anything wrong with that. But I guess, and this goes to your point, is don't say something that you aren't. Don't try and say that you're this or that when, okay, you're not published. That's fine, right? I'm not widely published either, but I'm not going around saying I am. Don't say you did all this research and then you don't show all of this stuff. Okay, that's different. I don't need to hear every other page, I'm a doctor. I did research. I don't say that.
The work speaks louder than the titles. And one couple that demonstrates that very well are the Gottmans.
I mentioned this on one of my other podcasts.
I just got it's semi-recent, and we don't have to get into the Gottman because I know we're running out of time and we have to wrap up. But, she published a book called 7 Dates. And most of their book, if not all of their book for the public, is nothing like the Brene Brown books or other like Brene Brown, because to be fair, there are others. It's not just Brene Brown. There are others like her that are very popular right now. Yeah. And the Gottmans are very popular as well. And you can write something in a simplistic way, but accurate way. You can write something that is accessible to the public. We don't need to go into the jargon of attachment, relationship patterns,
Yeah.
self-conscious roots of the neurocircuitry of shame and all that. We don't need all of that to get the public's attention. I think that's a writing skill, right? You
Yes.
can be a
Yes.
good writer to write a book. So that's number one. Otherwise, you can be a good lecturer, you can be a good professor, you may not
Yeah.
be a good writer. And you have to back up your knowledge with science, which they do. They have, of course, dozens and thousands of publication. Now they have their institute, their program. It's a marketing tool. We can, be for or against it, but it shows in the books that they write that the content speaks for itself.
Yeah.
I don't think they have, to my knowledge and to my recollection, they do mention their credentials. They do talk about, her being a therapist and him being a researcher once.
Mm-hmm.
There is no need for more emphasis on their credentials, because their credentials and the backup of it speaks louder than the words. So I think that whenever people read a whole lot of, and this is scientifically proven, and she's not the only one. Again, I went to a training on a psychological assessment that is used in the workplace, and for half of that training, the speaker was talking about the research, and my flags were up. It's like, you don't have to sell research that hard when the research is good.
Right. Yeah. No.
Take away from it.
I totally agree. I'll leave us with 4 examples, because I don't mind critiquing people's work. And again, I'm not necessarily critiquing her as an individual. I really am critiquing the work, and that's why I come hard on it, because I think it's important. But I'll give 4 examples. So one example is the Gottmans. They do this. I've mentioned them before here. They're a couple. They're scientists in their own right, and they do research and science on marriage, and I think probably divorce as well, in their lab. And then they publish it, and then they write more popularized books, and it's very good. I'll give a small plug here. I had on my podcast previous episode, Jono Paquette. He's a licensed clinical psychologist out in California. He's a great guy. And his book, he's written 3 books, but his most recent one is Awestruck, and it's about the emotion of awe and wonder. And I said it on the podcast, half the book is a lit review. That's really what it is. It's a lit review. You go back to the notes section, and it's, all the citations. And then the second half is probably more of a practical, tangible way of how we could use this. Great. That's fine. It's readable, understandable. Third, give him a plug too. Scott Barry Kaufman. He's a psychologist. He has a very popular podcast. He wrote a book this year, I think it came out, maybe late last year, called Transcend. Great book. It's probably one of the best books of merging theory. He does the kind of existential humanistic theory, all the research, and then all of he has the self-help aspects of it. Fantastic. The research is quality, very good. Theory, very good. And then the self-help stuff is very good, very readable. And then lastly, it just came out a month ago. The giant in the field, Lisa Feldman Barrett, wrote a small coffee table sized book, 7.5 lessons for the brain.
Oh, it's fantastic.
It's a fantastic book. It's understandable. It's readable. Yeah. What's hilarious is that, all of the references would be longer than the actual book. And so she gives like the annotated version and then says, here's my website where you can read all of the references I have. And she doesn't mention once, I'm a doctor. Here's all the research. Here's all the research. She doesn't do it that way. So there are examples. I've just listed 4 of people that do this.
I would add Kristen Neff to your list.
Okay. I'm not familiar with her, but okay.
Not familiar with her, but she's self-compassion, which is also a big word. It's also a pop word right now. Field on its own. And she has a number of books, one of which is Fierce Self-Compassion. So again, designed for the public, and it's excellently well done with a topic that is more abstract than that. So I would personally add her to your list, at least from what's hot and popular in the here and now, and closer to a little bit what Brene Brown and others like Brene Brown are trying or attempting to do.
Yeah. So I guess my closing point on this is that it is important for scientists and it's important for clinicians to be able to explain science to the public in honest, transparent, in readable, relatable ways. And there are people that do that, and there are people that do not. And just because someone is popular or trendy doesn't mean that we should have to, just settle for that. And we should at least prop up other people that do it more honestly and commiserate with actual science. And, maybe more forcefully critique people that don't, even if they are super popular or whatever. And I think those are important. I think those are important battles to have in some ways in a battle of ideas. And this applies to other disciplines as well. It's not just psychology or whatever. This applies in plenty of fields. So we hit a lot of things. we talked about a lot of things. It's crazy that 3 hours is goes by really quick. And obviously you and I both are professors, and you can teach a whole semester or whatever on stress and how it works. And, there's plenty of things that you can go much longer. So the abbreviated versions hopefully will whet the appetites of some people to go and check some of the people we've mentioned, and, some of the resources and all that stuff that are out there that are really, really good. So, I had a lot of fun. It was so awesome to talk in the clinical world and talk about a lot of things. And plenty of people have been joking with me that they say, you do psychology, but we don't hear you talk about it. You talk about politics and philosophy. And I said, look, I promise I do. I'll get some clinical people in here, and we'll geek out about it. So I'm can't think of anybody better to do that with. So I really appreciate your time and energy and your brain, downloading your brain for a couple hours. I really appreciate that too. So just is there anything you want to say at the end, or is there anywhere where people can find you or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I'm on Psychology Today. I also, I'm not on a lot of social media platforms, but and this has been fun, and for me, the teaching part, the presenting part, the psychoeducation part is really an intrinsic part of what we do. With that comes a whole lot of responsibility, but also flexibility. Like I'm the first one who, wants to be shown wrong or to change my mind about a particular subject.
Me too. Yeah.
The opinions of never say never, never say always. And it's been a pleasure. It was a nice conversation. I really enjoyed, the topics we addressed today. So
yeah, no, I did as well. And people, clients are more than fortunate to have you. So that's super awesome. And keep doing what you're doing, and we'll get you on here again and keep tackling more topics.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. All righty. Okay, bye.